The Nevada desert doesn't forgive mistakes. It just keeps them. Cold, dark, and permanent as the railroad tracks that cut through the emptiness like old wounds that never healed right. Tonight, those tracks hold something that shouldn't exist. A tiny shape wrapped in a filthy blanket, lying still in the path of whatever comes next. 12 Harley engines die one by one as Jace Maddox raises his fist, and the silence that follows is the loudest thing any of these men have ever heard. He walks forward alone, crouches down, pulls back the edge of that blanket and sees a face. 5 years old maybe, dirt-streaked, tear-dried, and a single word pinned to her chest that hits harder than any bullet, any prison door, any goodbye he's ever survived. That word is going to change every single life in this story. Stay with us all the way to the end. Drop a like if this hits you somewhere real, and tell us in the comments what city you're watching from tonight. We read every single one. The Nevada desert in January doesn't just get cold, it gets mean. The kind of cold that finds the gap between your collar and your neck and stays there, working its way down into your spine until your bones feel like they're made of something brittle and old. The kind of cold that turns the stars hard and sharp above the basin. No atmosphere left to soften them. Just white points of light stabbing through the black like accusations. The kind of cold that makes a man remember every warm place he's ever lost. Jace Maddox had been riding for 11 hours. He felt every one of them in his lower back, in the old exit wound scar above his left hip that tightened whenever the temperature dropped below 30, in the knuckles of both hands wrapped around the Harley's grips through 2 layers of leather and liner. He felt them in the back of his jaw, where a tooth had been broken in a county facility in Nevada 9 years ago and never properly fixed, just ground down and lived with. He felt them in the particular exhaustion that came from riding through darkness. Not physical exhaustion exactly, but the kind that settled in your eyes and your chest when you'd been staring at headlight-lit asphalt for too long, and the road started to feel less like something you were traveling over and more like something you were falling into. But the ride had been worth it. Behind him, stretched out in a loose 2x2 column that ate up a quarter mile of US 93 South, 11 other Harley-Davidsons rolled through the desert night. The Iron Vultures, MC. 12 members present, 2 more at home with family obligations, 1 in the hospital in Reno with a busted appendix that had gone septic before anyone made him admit it was serious. The club ran 15 riders on a good month. Tonight, 12 was enough. They were returning from Elko. 3 days, 2 nights, a charity run organized by a coalition of veteran support groups that mostly consisted of arguing over logistics, drinking bad coffee from folding tables, and raising somewhere north of $40,000 through auction, entry fees, and the particular generosity that descended on civilians when they watched scarred men ride chrome machines through their town and understood, even if only dimly, even if only for an hour, that these were people who had given something unrecoverable and received very little back. The charity was called Second Crossing. It helped veterans transition out of federal corrections facilities. The Iron Vultures had been founding sponsors for 6 years. Most of the members had their own reasons for caring about that particular cause. Most of those reasons didn't get discussed. Jace had started the club 8 years ago with 4 other men in a rented storage unit outside Winnemucca with 3 functional motorcycles, 1 broken one, a case of beer, and a shared understanding that none of them were fit for what the civilian world expected of them, but that they still needed something to be part of. They'd grown slowly, deliberately. They hadn't taken in every hard case who showed up looking for brotherhood. They'd turned away more than they'd accepted, because the wrong man in the wrong room at the wrong moment could destroy everything, and every one of them had lived through exactly that kind of destruction in at least one previous life. Now they had a clubhouse, a small piece of land outside a town called Ridgeline, 40 miles east of Winnemucca. Population 800 and not growing. An old roadside diner they'd bought for back taxes 6 years ago, renovated badly but functionally, kept warm in winter by a wood stove that ate through a cord every 3 weeks, and a gas furnace that made a sound like distant artillery when it kicked on at night. There was a bar, a kitchen, a common room with mismatched furniture worn to the shape of men who spent most of their waking hours in it, 4 bunk rooms in the back, and a detached garage that housed the bikes and smelled of oil and cold metal, and the specific satisfaction of machines kept in working order. It wasn't much. To 12 men who had each, at various points in their lives, had significantly less, it was everything. The ride home from Elko was 4 hours on a good night. Tonight was not going to be a good night, though none of them knew that yet as they crested the long grade above the Humboldt Valley and started the descent toward the flat basin stretching south toward ridgeline. The temperature had dropped another 4 degrees in the last hour. The sky ahead showed no moon. It had set 2 hours ago, and the basin below was dark except for the occasional orange smear of a ranch light miles off the highway. The road was straight and empty, and the engine settled into that particular highway drone that wasn't quite comfortable but was familiar enough to become invisible after long enough. Jace rode point. He always rode point. It wasn't a formal designation. There was nothing formal about how the Iron Vultures organized themselves, but it had calcified into expectation over years of rides, because Jace saw things other men missed, and because following him had never gotten anyone killed, which was a standard that spoke for itself given the men involved. He had the eyes of someone who had learned to read terrain for threat as a professional discipline before he was old enough to vote, and that skill didn't retire just because the wars it had been forged in officially ended. He saw the shape on the tracks before his headlight reached it. It registered first as anomaly. Something wrong about the geometry of the crossing, the horizontal line of the rails broken by a vertical element that shouldn't be there. His hand came up automatically, fist closed, the signal passing back through the column without a word spoken. Throttles eased down. Engines dropped from highway speed to idle to silence in a ragged wave, and the sound that replaced them was the wind coming cold across the basin floor and the distant tick of cooling metal. 12 men sat on dead bikes at a railroad crossing in the Nevada dark, and none of them spoke. Jace climbed off his Harley. The crossing was a single-track Union Pacific line that served a handful of mines in the basin. Train frequency was low, 1 or 2 a day, sometimes none. The next scheduled train wasn't until morning, which meant nothing to a freight railroad with a flexible schedule, but it meant that whatever was on the tracks had been there for some time without consequence. He walked forward in the combined wash of 12 sets of headlights, his boots crunching through the thin skin of frost that had formed on the gravel shoulders of the crossing. He stopped. What lay on the tracks was a bundle wrapped in a blanket that had once been gray and was now the color of a road shoulder. Grit-colored, weather-colored, the color of something that had been carried a long way and set down without care. The bundle was small. It moved. Not movement exactly. Trembling. Jace Maddox had survived 2 deployments in 2 different theaters, 8 months in a Nevada State Correctional Facility, 3 separate instances of violent conflict that had left scars visible and otherwise, the death of his younger brother by overdose, and the end of a marriage to a woman who had loved him genuinely and faithfully until the weight of what he carried became something she could no longer hold alongside her own life. He had seen things that had reorganized his understanding of what human beings were capable of doing to each other, to themselves, to the people they were supposed to protect. He crouched beside the bundle and pulled back the edge of the blanket with hands that were steady by training, if nothing else. And what he found inside was a child. A girl. Small even for whatever age she was. He would learn later that she was 5 years and 4 months old. Dark hair matted with what he hoped was just desert dust. Face so streaked with dried tears and grime that her skin color was impossible to read cleanly. Eyes closed, but the trembling told him she was conscious in some fractured, protective way, the animal part of a child's brain shutting down everything non-essential to preserve the core warmth. She was dressed in a sweater, pink once, filthy now, jeans that had been hemmed up unevenly with the wrong color thread, and shoes that were 2 sizes too large and had been stuffed with newspaper to make them fit. The shoes stopped his breath for a moment. Someone had taken the time to stuff the shoes with newspaper, which meant someone had known they didn't fit and had found a workaround, which meant someone had dressed this child with at least a fraction of deliberate care before placing her on railroad tracks in the Nevada desert in January and walking away. He almost missed the note. It was pinned to the sweater with a safety pin, a detail that hit him later in ways he wasn't prepared for, the small domestic precision of a safety pin in the context of abandonment. The paper was folded once and had gotten damp and dried again, the ink smeared at the edges but legible at the center where the fold had protected it. One word: unwanted. Jace Maddox had been shot at professionally and survived it. He had been hit hard enough to lose consciousness on 2 separate occasions in 2 different contexts, He had read a coroner's report with his brother's name on it, sitting alone in a parking lot in the rain, and held himself together through willpower alone. He was not a man who broke. The word on that paper broke something, not loudly, not dramatically, not with tears or sound or any visible collapse. It broke the way old structures break from inside, a small, deep fracture running through load-bearing material that changes the geometry of everything above it forever. He felt it in his sternum. He felt it in the specific ache behind his eyes that he associated with grief. He felt it in the way his next breath came in wrong and had to be corrected deliberately. He folded the note and put it in his jacket pocket. Then he unzipped the jacket, a battered black leather cut with the Iron Vulture's back patch worn nearly to ghost on the shoulders, the president's patch on the left breast, years of road grime worked into every crease, and wrapped it around the child. The cold hit his flannel shirt immediately, and then his skin, but he didn't feel it particularly. He lifted the girl from the tracks with both arms, one under her knees and one supporting her back, the practiced grip of someone who had carried wounded people before in conditions that didn't allow for gentleness of approach. She stirred, didn't open her eyes, but made a sound. Not a cry, not quite, more like the sound of something that had been holding itself very still against a threat and was beginning to understand the threat had changed shape. He carried her back to the bikes. The 11 men waiting there had seen the shape on the tracks from their headlights, had understood it was a child by the time Jace was crouching over it, and had done what the Iron Vultures did when the situation was unclear and Jace was handling point. They stayed put, and they kept their mouths shut, and they watched the road and the dark beyond it for anything that wasn't supposed to be there. Now they watched him walk back carrying a girl, wrapped in his own jacket, and the silence among them was different from the earlier silence. That one had been tactical. This one was something else. Goose McAllister, the club's sergeant-at-arms and the largest human being within 100 miles of this crossing, 6'4", 260, former Navy with a face that had absorbed considerable professional punishment over 4 decades, climbed off his bike and took 2 steps forward and stopped. His expression did a thing that the people who knew him well would have recognized as the particular rearrangement that happened when something bypassed all his defenses. He'd seen that expression exactly twice before. Once when his daughter was born. Once at a funeral in San Diego 12 years ago. "Christ," he said softly. The word wasn't directed at anyone. "She's alive," Jay said. "Hypothermic. We need to move." "What happened to her?" "Someone left her there." The silence that followed that statement was heavy, in a way that silence rarely gets outside of the immediate aftermath of violence or loss. Every man in that column had his own specific reason to understand what it felt like to be placed somewhere and left there without sufficient protection. They carried those reasons differently, some loudly, in the form of visible damage and behavioral patterns that made civilians nervous, some quietly, as an interior weather system that rarely showed at the surface. But none of them were strangers to abandonment in its various forms, and none of them were strangers to what it did to a person. The child whimpered. Her hands had found the collar of Jace's flannel shirt and closed around it in a grip that was remarkable for a child in her condition. "Ridgeline," Jace said. "Fast." They made it in 38 minutes. The Iron Vulture's clubhouse sat 300 yards off the highway, down a gravel road marked by a hand-painted sign that said "Private" and a rusted iron gate that was never closed because it had been open so long the hinges had seized. The diner building itself dated from the 1960s, low, flat-roofed, with a line of south-facing windows that had once looked out on a functioning highway full of travelers and now looked out on a county road that saw maybe 40 cars a day. The neon sign above the entrance, Desert Stop Diner, letters in red and blue, still worked because Cutter, who had done electrical work before his hands started shaking bad enough that he couldn't hold tolerances, had rewired it 4 years ago as a personal project. It buzzed and flickered in the cold and threw colored light across the frost on the gravel. There was a satellite dish on the roof. There were 3 pickup trucks in the lot beside the garage, one running on borrowed time mechanically and kept alive by devotion alone. There was a wind chime made from shell casings hanging by the front door that Petey, the club's youngest member at 26, had made in a craft phase that had lasted 6 weeks and produced an alarming quantity of decorated objects that now lived throughout the clubhouse without anyone quite admitting they'd been accepted. The wind moved the chimes, and they made a sound that was specific and strange and had become, without discussion, the sound of home. They came through this front door in a mass of cold air and noise and leather, and Jace went straight to the wood stove in the common room's center. The stove was burning low, banked for the night, but there were coals underneath, and he got the draft open and added wood, while Goose pulled the old couch closer, and Petey disappeared toward the kitchen with the velocity of someone who needed to be useful and had identified his lane. The girl hadn't opened her eyes through any of this. She was breathing steadily now. He'd confirmed that on the ride, one hand at her back tracking her chest movement. But her temperature was still wrong, and her color under the grime was not good. "Does anyone here have medical?" Jace asked the room. "Rotational EMT, 2 years expired," said Denny Hogue, a lean, sunburned man in his 40s who had come to the Vultures via a circuitous route involving the Army, a contracting firm in the Gulf, and a period of several years he didn't discuss. He was already crouching beside the couch. "She needs warming, not ER. Airways are clear, breathing's regular, extremities are cold but not frostbitten. Someone get blankets. More than one. Stack them." 3 men moved at once. "Petey?" Denny called toward the kitchen. "Hot water, not boiling, coming," Petey called back. A beat. "Should I make coffee?" A man named Rodrigo Vasquez, who went by Switch because of a knife trick he could do with his left hand and a complicated history with mechanical relays, sat down in the armchair nearest the stove and said nothing, but didn't look away from the child for the next hour. Switch was 44 years old and had been with the club for 5 years and had a photograph in his bunkroom wallet of a girl who would be 14 now, if she was alive, which he didn't know because her mother had relocated with her to a place he hadn't been able to trace without crossing legal lines he'd decided not to cross. He didn't say any of this. He just sat with his forearms on his knees and his dark eyes steady on the small shape under the blankets and breathed. The warming process was slow and undramatic. Heat source, layers, hydration when she could take it, monitoring. Denny ran it with the quiet competence of someone who had done field medicine under conditions that made this look simple. The girl came up through her hypothermic state the way you come up out of deep water, incrementally, with pauses, testing the air before committing to it. At 40 minutes, she opened her eyes. They were brown, very dark brown, the color of good coffee in low light, and they were looking at Jace, who had been sitting on the floor beside the couch since he'd set her down, close enough that she could reach him if she needed to, and far enough away that she didn't feel cornered. He'd learned something about that particular distance from watching frightened animals. The principal translated. She didn't speak. She looked at him for a long time with those dark eyes while the stove popped and the neon sign outside threw its red and blue flicker across the windows. Jace didn't speak either. He met her eyes, and he kept his face as still and quiet as he knew how to make it, which was very still and very quiet because he had had considerable practice. He let her look. Let her run whatever assessment a 5-year-old ran when she was trying to determine if the large, scarred man sitting on the floor beside her was the kind of danger that had brought her here, or a different kind of thing entirely. She reached out from under the blankets and put one small hand on his forearm. He didn't move. She kept it there. Something in the room breathed differently. That. Her name came out in pieces over the following hour. Ember. That was what she said when Petey crouched down with a mug of warm, sweet tea and asked her gently, in the particular gentle voice that Petey used for anything smaller than himself, which was most things. Ember. She said it like she was checking it, like she wasn't entirely sure it still applied. He asked her last name and she said nothing, just looked at the tea. He didn't push. She ate half a piece of toast that Rodrigo made without being asked, cutting it into triangles the way he could still remember his daughter had preferred, and drank most of the tea, and then she slept. The men rotated watch without establishing a rotation. Someone was always awake nearby, always within sight of the couch, because none of them could have slept anyway, and none of them needed to discuss why. Goose sat in the kitchen doorway with a coffee that had long gone cold. Denny checked her temperature every 45 minutes. Switch hadn't moved. Jace took the note from his pocket when the room had settled into its quiet post-midnight state and unfolded it under the low light of the lamp beside the bar. Unwanted. He looked at it for a while. He was thinking about the newspaper in her shoes. He was thinking about the safety pin. He was thinking about the blanket, which was filthy but had been thick once. The kind of blanket that had been purchased with care, not grabbed from a pile. Someone had wrapped her in a deliberate choice of covering and pinned a note that negated the deliberateness entirely. And that contradiction was either the most confusing thing about this or the most clarifying, and Jace was not yet certain which. He was thinking about the word itself. The specific word. Not just worthless or unwanted or burden, though the note said that word exactly, but the decision to reduce a child to a single word and pin it to her chest. The editorial choice of it. There was a cruelty in the precision that felt intentional in a way that frightened him in a register he hadn't expected. He folded the note again and put it back in his pocket. He would hand it to law enforcement when they had to involve law enforcement, which they would have to do and which he was already calculating the shape of. He understood what the next few days would look like in broad strokes. A police report, a welfare check, Child Protective Services involvement, questions about the club's fitness as custodians even in the temporary sense. He understood that the system was going to have opinions. He'd had extensive personal experience with the system having opinions about men who looked like him and lived like him, and he'd learned that its opinions frequently precluded its ability to see what was actually in front of it. He'd deal with that when it arrived. Right now, there was a child asleep on his couch, and the fire needed wood, and the coffee needed making, and the world outside the clubhouse walls was going to have to wait. The morning came gray and cold. Snow had started somewhere around 4 in the morning, not the dramatic snow of storms, but the quiet, persistent kind that accumulates without theater, flake by flake, covering everything in patient increments. By dawn, there were 3 inches on the gravel, and the diner's flat roof wore a skin of white that muffled sound and changed the quality of the light inside to something softer and less certain. Ember woke before most of the men. She woke the way children wake in unfamiliar places. Suddenly, completely, every sense engaged at once. Jace was sitting at the bar with coffee when he heard the change in her breathing from across the room, turned, and found her sitting upright on the couch with the blankets pulled around her and her eyes going over the room with the rapid inventory of someone checking for exits. He watched her find him without moving from his stool, and watched her make the calculation, and watched the calculation come down on the side of something other than immediate flight. He poured a second mug of coffee, added the amount of milk that the children of his acquaintance had tended to prefer, and walked to the couch with it. She looked at the mug. "It's mostly milk," he said. "If you want." She took it in both hands. He sat on the far end of the couch and drank his own coffee and looked at the snow coming down outside the window and didn't ask her anything. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who had both learned that silence was often safer than speaking and had mutually arrived at the same position on it. After a while, she said, "Where is this?" "Nevada, a place called Ridgeline. You were on the railroad crossing about 40 miles north." She processed this. "Were you there?" "Yes." "Did you put me there?" The question landed with a particular weight. He looked at her. She was looking at him directly, those dark eyes clear and serious, and he understood she was asking it as a genuine interrogation, not an accusation, just information gathering, establishing the facts of her situation with the pragmatism of a child who had learned that clarity was self-protective. "No," he said. "I found you." She nodded once, returned to looking at the snow. "Are you going to give me back?" she asked. He was very still for a moment. "Give you back to who?" She didn't answer. She wrapped both hands tighter around the coffee mug, and the expression on her face was the expression of someone who had asked a question and understood they'd given too much away in asking it, and was now closing down against the consequences of that transparency. It was not a look that belonged on a 5-year-old's face. It was a look that belonged on the face of someone who had been hurt enough times in the act of hoping that hope itself had become a liability. Jace Maddox had worn that expression himself. He recognized it in the way you recognize your own handwriting. "Nobody's giving you back anywhere right now," he said. "Right now you're warm and there's food and you're safe. That's all." She looked at him for a long moment, then she went back to the window. "Okay," she said quietly. He called it into Lander County Sheriff's Department at 7 that morning. He used the landline at the bar and gave them the basics. Club president found a minor on the tracks. Minor is safe at our location. Here is the address. In the flat, cooperative tone he'd developed over years of dealing with law enforcement from a position of negotiated mutual tolerance. The deputy who took the call was professional and brief. A unit would be there within 2 hours. He hung up and turned to find Goose standing in the kitchen doorway with his arms folded, reading his face. "How'd they sound?" Goose asked. "Routine. That'll last about 10 minutes after they get here and see who we are." "Probably. You want the guys cleaned up?" Jace thought about that. He thought about making 12 tattooed bikers presentable to law enforcement standards and what it would communicate, both that they had something to perform and that they believed they needed to, versus what it would communicate to leave them as they were, authentic, slightly intimidating, exactly what they were. He thought about Ember asleep on the couch again, one hand still loosely around the coffee mug she'd taken to bed. "No," he said. "They're not cleaning up for anyone. We are who we are." Goose made a sound that wasn't quite satisfaction, but was adjacent to it. "That's going to make this harder." "Probably." "You sleep?" "No." Goose nodded like that was the answer he'd expected. He disappeared back into the kitchen and the sound of breakfast being made, eggs, oil in a pan, the particular percussion of a cast iron skillet on a gas range, came through the doorway with the smell of it, which was the smell of safety in every domestic language that had ever existed. The sheriff's deputies arrived at 8:47. There were 2 of them, a senior deputy named Harland, who had dealt with the Iron Vultures on exactly 3 previous occasions with declining hostility and ascending tolerance, and a younger deputy named Caserta, who was doing his absolute best to maintain a professional neutral face and was approximately 60% successful. They did the walkthrough that procedure required, asked the questions that procedure required, photographed the note that Jace produced from his pocket, and arranged for a welfare transport to the county hospital for assessment that procedure required. Through all of it, Ember sat on the couch wrapped in the blanket and watched with those dark, careful eyes and said nothing. Harlan crouched in front of her at the end and said in the soft voice you used with traumatized children, "Hey, can you tell me your full name?" She looked at him for a moment. "Ember," she said. "Ember what? Do you know your last name?" She looked at Jace. He gave her nothing, no direction, just presence. She looked back at Harlan. "I don't know," she said. Harlan straightened up and met Jace's eyes over the child's head, and the look between them said things that neither of them articulated. The deputy had been doing this work for 19 years. He understood what a child who didn't know her last name usually meant, and what it didn't. "We're going to need to run her through the system," Harlan said quietly to Jace at the door, while Caserta did paperwork in the living room. "Missing persons, welfare databases. If nobody's filed on her—" "Nobody filed on her," Jace said. "You know that." Harlan looked at him steadily. "I know the note. I don't know the situation yet." "She had newspaper in her shoes," Jace said. "Someone knew they didn't fit and packed them anyway, and then left her on train tracks in January." A long pause. "I hear you. Do you?" Another pause, different quality. "Jace, I have to do this by the book. Whatever you're feeling about it right now, that child goes through proper channels. You know that." "I know," Jace said. "I'm not arguing that. I'm telling you what I saw. I'm asking you to look at this without the assumptions about who you're talking to." Harland held his gaze. He was not a bad man. Jace had determined this over the course of 3 interactions and updated it now to confirmed. He was a man inside a system that had its own gravity and its own momentum and its own way of seeing things. And like most men inside systems, he moved within that gravity most of the time. And occasionally, when something slipped past all the training and the procedure and the professional distance, felt the weight of something real. "I'll process this as a priority," Harlan said. "I appreciate it. She can't stay here long term while the investigation is open." "I understand." "You understand or you agree?" "I understand," Jace said. "Those are different things." Harlan almost smiled. It was a tired, complicated almost smile, the kind that lived at the intersection of respect and resignation, and it lasted exactly a moment before professional distance reasserted itself. "We'll be in touch," he said. He called Caserta and they went out the door into the white morning, and their cruiser made tracks in the new snow all the way to the road. Jace stood in the open doorway and watched them go. Behind him, from the common room, Petey said quietly, "She asked if you were coming back inside." The days that followed had a particular texture to them. Outside the clubhouse, the desert did what the desert did in winter, cycling through cold nights and brilliant clear days, the snow coming and melting and coming again, the highway empty and the sky enormous. Inside, 12 men who had organized their lives around brotherhood and motion and purpose found themselves adapting to the presence of something that changed the register of everything. Ember moved through the clubhouse with the careful deliberateness of a child mapping unfamiliar territory. She tested spaces before committing to them. She would stand in a doorway until she'd understood the room, then enter. She ate when food was offered, but always checked the face of the person offering it before accepting. She slept in the bunk room they'd cleared for her with the door open and the lamp in the hallway on, and twice in the first week Jace woke at 3 in the morning to find her sitting in the common room, not sleeping, but not distressed either, just watching the fire through the wood stove glass with an expression of deep private attention that made him think of soldiers on post, the face of someone who had learned that sleeping through the night was a luxury available to people who didn't need to stay ready. He sat with her on those nights, didn't talk, made cocoa when she seemed interested in cocoa, let her set the pace. On the 4th day, she drew on the walls. She'd found a box of crayons in the bunk room, Petey's from his craft phase, and she'd started on the section of drywall beside the wood stove, a slow, careful rendering in multiple colors of what appeared to be, on examination, 12 motorcycles in a row. She drew them with the specific concentration of a child who took the accuracy of representation seriously, each bike slightly different from the last. When she reached the 12th, she added a 13th, smaller, with pink wheels. Goose stood beside Jace, looking at this for a while. "That's us," Goose said. "I know," Jace said. "She's got my shovelhead dead on. That's a 76 shovelhead she drew. You can tell by the engine box shape." "She been spending time in the garage?" "Denny showed her the bikes yesterday. Said she wanted to look. She's got an eye." Jace looked at the small pink-wheeled 13th motorcycle. That night, after Ember was in her bunk, he stood in the common room with his coffee and looked at those 13 bikes on the wall and felt the thing in his sternum again. Not a braking this time, but something more like a complicated pressure, the feeling of something trying to find the shape it was supposed to be. He'd been married once, 4 years, to a woman named Layla, who had been brave enough to love him with full knowledge of what she was choosing and had stayed until the weight of what he couldn't give her became a different kind of cruelty. They'd talked once, early in the marriage, about children. He'd said he didn't know if he was capable of being what a child needed. He'd meant it honestly. She'd said she thought he was wrong, but that she wouldn't argue it, and she hadn't, and it had been one of the many things that had collected between them over years until the collection became the relationship, and the relationship became unsustainable. He looked at the drawing on the wall. He thought maybe he'd been wrong about what he was capable of. He wasn't sure yet, but he was looking at the evidence and running the calculation with the data he had, and the data he had was changing. On the 8th day, the first reporter showed up. She was from a regional news outlet, young, earnest, armed with the particular energy of someone who had identified a human interest story and was vibrating with the potential of it. She'd heard about the child found on the tracks from someone in the sheriff's department. Not Harland, who Jace had enough respect for to assume hadn't leaked it. Probably Caserta, who was young and probably didn't fully understand yet that some information created problems when it traveled. She'd driven out from Winnemucca to the address on the police report and knocked on the gate. Jace didn't open it. "I'm not interested in a story," he said through the intercom. "I just want to—" "I understand what you want. The answer is no." He cut the intercom and walked back inside to find Denny standing in the doorway with his coffee and an expression. "She'll run it anyway," Denny said. "I know. With what she can see from the road, probably. Bikers, abandoned kid, neon diner. That's a story that writes itself and not in the direction we want." "I know," Jace said again. "So what are you going to do?" Jace looked past Denny toward the common room where Ember was sitting on the floor with a book of some kind that Petey had produced from somewhere, sounding out words with her finger under each one and her tongue barely visible between her lips with the effort of it. She looked up and found him looking and held his gaze for a moment with those dark, serious eyes. "Handle it," Jace said. The story ran 2 days later. It was not as bad as it could have been. The reporter was young, but not cruel, and the framing was sympathetic if imprecise, a child found abandoned, currently in the care of motorcycle club members while authorities investigated. There was a photograph of the clubhouse exterior taken from the road. There was no photograph of Ember, which Jace had been prepared to pursue legally if necessary, and which the reporter had apparently had the instinct to withhold without being asked. The story was picked up by 2 state outlets and 1 national wire service by the end of the day. By the following morning, 4 other reporters were parked on the county road outside the gate, and the clubhouse phone had rung 11 times from numbers he didn't recognize. Child welfare advocates called from 2 different nonprofit organizations. A family law attorney in Reno called to offer services. A woman in Las Vegas called to say she was Ember's grandmother, and Jace told her that all inquiries should go through the sheriff's department and ended the call, then called Harland immediately to report it. Harland said they'd look into it. He sounded tired. 3 days after the story ran, the first caseworker arrived from the Nevada Division of Child and Family Services. She was a woman named Paulette Graham, mid-40s, small and precise, with the particular manner of a professional who had been doing an emotionally difficult job for a long time and had developed efficiency as a form of self-protection. She wasn't unfriendly, but she was careful, and she looked at the clubhouse and the men in it with an assessment that she tried to keep professional and mostly succeeded. She interviewed Ember in the bunk room with the door mostly closed, and Jace standing in the hallway because that was what Ember had silently communicated she needed by looking at the door and then at Jace in a sequence that he translated accurately. He could hear pieces of it, not words, mostly tones. Paulette's voice measured and calm. Ember's voice flat and careful in the way it had been for the first 2 days and had mostly moved past since then. He heard one exchange clearly enough. "Paulette, can you tell me about where you lived before?" Ember, after a pause. "Different places." Paulette. "What kind of places?" A longer pause. "I'm not supposed to talk about that." Jace leaned his back against the wall and closed his eyes and breathed steadily and did not move. After the interview, Paulette came out and spoke to him in the hallway, and her manner was different by approximately 1 degree. Still professional, still careful, but with something behind it that was less assessing and more considered. She'd seen children in difficult situations. She'd seen children who had been failed and children who had been rescued, and children who had been both in the same lifetime. She looked at Ember, who had emerged from the bunk room and gone directly to stand beside Jace, in the particular way she had developed of standing in his approximate vicinity without demanding contact, and Paulette's face did something that she controlled before it went anywhere it would affect her report. "She's comfortable here," Paulette said. "Yes," Jace said. "That's—" She stopped, started again, more carefully. "In these situations, there's protocol that has to be followed regardless of the circumstance." "I understand protocol. Her placement is going to be subject to review, your club, your background." "My record is public," Jace said. 18 months, served 14, nonviolent, 2019. Everything since is clean. She looked at him. "It's not just that, it's the club, the environment. There are standards." "Her shoes had newspaper in them," Jace said. Paulette stopped. "Whoever packed those shoes knew she had somewhere to go and wanted her feet not to freeze on the way there," Jace said. "And then they pinned a note to her chest that said, 'Unwanted,' and put her on railroad tracks. I want you to think about that picture very carefully before you decide what environment she shouldn't be in." The silence in the hallway was a long one. Paulette Graham had 19 years of this work. She had read more case files than she could count. She had made calls that helped children and calls that hurt them, and she carried both kinds with her in different internal compartments that leaked into each other at inconvenient moments. She looked at Ember, who was now looking at the crayon drawing on the common room wall. The 13 motorcycles, the small pink-wheeled one, with an expression of private ownership, the look of someone in a space that had become theirs in a way that mattered. "I'll be back in 3 days," Paulette said. "We'll have preliminary placement discussions then." After she left, Ember looked up at Jace. "Is she going to take me somewhere?" she asked. He was careful. He'd been careful about this from the beginning. No promises that he couldn't keep, no certainties that weren't certain. He understood that making promises to a child and breaking them was one of the more specific and lasting forms of damage a person could inflict. "I don't know yet," he said. "I'm going to work on it." She looked at him for a moment with those dark eyes. Then she nodded, the same single nod she'd given him that first morning, the nod that meant she was filing the information and drawing no premature conclusions. Okay, she said. She went back to her book. He stood in the hallway and listened to the snow starting again on the roof, and the wind against the windows, and the fire in the stove, and Petey somewhere in the kitchen making something that smelled of cinnamon. And he thought about what he'd said to Paulette Graham. He thought about the newspaper and the shoes. He thought about the safety pin. He thought about the word the safety pin. He thought about the word unwanted, and about what it meant that someone had arrived at that word and chosen it carefully enough to write it down and pin it to a child, and then walked away from a railroad crossing in the Nevada dark. Someone had put her there. Someone had wanted her gone. And in Jace's considerable experience with people who wanted things gone, wanting something gone and leaving it on a railroad track were two different categories of intent. One was despair. One was something else. The question was which one? He didn't have an answer yet, but the question had started doing something in the back of his mind that he recognized from other contexts. It was organizing itself, building structure, cross-referencing the small details he'd collected since the night of the crossing. The newspaper and the safety pin, and the specific word and the way an Ember went still when asked where she'd lived before. The way she'd said, "I'm not supposed to talk about that. Not I don't remember. Not I don't know. Supposed to," which was the language of instruction. Someone had told her not to speak. He was still running the calculation when the gate alarm tripped at 11:47 that night. He was at the bar and on his feet before the sound finished, his hand finding the edge of the counter for orientation in the dark, moving toward the window by memory. The gate alarm was a simple motion sensor rigged to a buzzer at the bar. Not sophisticated, not subtle, but functional. Something had broken the sensor line at the gate. He looked through the window at the road. There was a vehicle parked on the county road just beyond the gate. Big, dark. A pickup truck with the engine running and the lights off, which was the choice of a man who wanted to be invisible and didn't know that sitting in the cold dark with your engine running was the opposite of that, because exhaust plumes white in cold air, like a signal fire. Jace stood at the window for a moment. Then he went and woke Goose. The big man was upright and present before Jace finished saying his name, which was the particular skill of men who had learned to sleep in places where the distance between sleeping and not sleeping was survival critical. He looked at Jace and read the situation from Jace's posture alone. "Gate," Goose said. "Road, truck, engine running, lights off." Goose was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. "Could be press." "Press uses their lights," Jace said. "They want to be seen. They want you to know they're waiting." Another 4 seconds. "You want to call Harland?" "Not yet. Let me see what it is first." He went outside through the back, cutting around the perimeter in the dark and the cold and the new snow, moving along the fence line with his hands in his pockets and his breath controlled, approaching the gate from the north at an angle that kept him out of any sightline from the road. The snow made the approach quieter than gravel, but visible. He'd be leaving tracks, which mattered less right now than position. He got to the corner of the fence and looked through the post gaps at the truck. It was a black Ford pickup, 5 to 8 years old, one brake light cracked and taped. Nevada plates, though he couldn't read them at this angle. The engine was running and the driver's window was down despite the cold, which meant the driver was looking and listening and waiting for something. Jace stayed at the fence post and held still and looked back. For 2.5 minutes, nothing moved. Then the driver's arm came out the window. Just an arm, short-sleeved despite the temperature, tattoos visible even at this distance, and dropped a cigarette butt into the snow. The window came up. The truck's headlights came on. It sat there with its lights on for a moment, pointing at the gate and the clubhouse sign and the diner building behind it, illuminating everything, making itself seen now that it had decided to be seen. Then it pulled away south down the county road, and the taillights shrank in the dark and disappeared. Jace stood at the fence post for a while after it was gone. The question had been doing its building work in the back of his mind since Paulette Graham's visit, since Ember's "I'm not supposed to talk about that," since the newspaper and the shoes. He'd been organizing details, cross-referencing, looking for the shape of what had put a 5-year-old on a railroad track with a word pinned to her chest. He hadn't found the shape yet, but the shape had just driven by and looked at his gate and made sure he knew it was looking. He walked back inside through the snow. He stood in the hallway outside Ember's bunk room and listened to her breathing in the dark. Steady. Slow. Deeply asleep in the way of children who have finally, in some place they didn't expect, felt safe enough to let go of the guard they'd been keeping. He was still standing there when Goose appeared at the hallway's end. "Well," Goose said quietly. Jace looked at the bunk room door for a moment. "We need to start keeping watch," he said. "Real watch. Rotation. Starting tonight." Goose was still for a beat. He was a man who processed things internally and completely before responding, and when he responded, it was always from a place of settled conclusion. "You think someone's looking for her?" "I think someone left her on those tracks on purpose," Jace said. "I think there's a difference between abandonment and disposal, and I think whoever was in that truck knows we have her." The hallway held the silence between them for a moment, the quiet of the building around it, the small sound of Ember sleeping. "And I think," Jace said, "that they're trying to figure out if we're a problem." The question hanging in the air between them, the question neither of them had the answer to yet, was what happened when they decided the answer was yes. The rotation started that same night. Jace drew it up in his head and gave it to Goose, and Goose executed it without comment, which was the particular efficiency of men who had run security before under conditions where inefficiency had a body count. 2-hour shifts. One man at the front window with eyes on the gate and the county road beyond it. One man at the back door covering the service approach from the south. No external lights except the neon sign, which they left running because killing it would signal to anyone watching that something had changed. The idea was that whoever had been in that truck would see the same thing they'd seen before. The diner sign, the dark, the normal closed-up nighttime look of the place. While 12 sets of eyes turned the perimeter into something different from the inside. Jace took the first shift himself, 3 to 5 in the morning, sitting on a bar stool pulled to the side of the front window where he could see the road without being visible from it. The snow had stopped. The desert was quiet and white, and the cold had deepened toward the bone-aching end of the dial, the thermometer outside the window reading 9 degrees Fahrenheit in the small hours. He drank coffee that he'd made strong enough to work and watched the county road and thought. Goose relieved him at 5. Jace didn't sleep. He went to the kitchen and made breakfast because the kitchen was the one room in the building with no windows facing the road, and it gave him something to do with his hands while his mind ran its calculations. He made eggs and toast and a pot of oatmeal that nobody had asked for, but that materialized on the common room table by 6:30 like a small domestic fact, and by 7 the men on the morning rotation were eating it in the particular comfortable silence of people who had shared enough meals to not need conversation to fill them. Ember woke at 7:15 and came to the table in her socks and sat down and looked at the oatmeal with an expression of serious consideration before accepting a bowl. She ate with both elbows on the table, which nobody corrected. Petey sat across from her and read a motorcycle magazine and passed her a section of it that had pictures. And she studied the pictures with the same concentration she brought to everything, moving her finger across the page without touching it. Jace watched this from the kitchen doorway and thought about the truck, and thought about the word unwanted, and thought about the safety pin and the newspaper in the shoes, and thought about what Paulette Graham had said, preliminary placement discussions, and thought about the fact that Ember had said, "I'm not supposed to talk about that," in the flat, careful voice of a child who had learned the cost of talking. He was running out of time on multiple fronts simultaneously, and the particular skill of running out of time on multiple fronts without visibly fracturing was one he'd developed through necessity across enough years that it had become something close to instinct. But instinct didn't mean effortless. Instinct just meant you didn't show what it cost. Switch appeared at his shoulder with his coffee and stood beside him and looked at Ember at the table. Switch almost never initiated conversation. When he spoke, it was because silence had reached the end of its utility. "She eat like that every morning," Switch said. "Pretty much. Focused. She does everything focused." Switch was quiet for a moment. "My daughter used to eat like that. Same thing. Both elbows, 2 hands on the spoon. Drove her mother insane." He paused. "I thought it was a concentration thing, like she was taking it seriously." Jace said nothing. He understood what Switch was doing and what it cost him to do it, and he wasn't going to fill the space around it with anything cheap. "Haven't seen her in 6 years, Switch said. "Vanessa, her name." He stopped. "She'd be 14. "I know. You been looking into it?" "Not my business to look." "Didn't ask whose business it was." Jace looked at him. Switch was looking at the table where Ember was now showing Petey something in the magazine with considerable authority, apparently correcting his interpretation of whatever engine diagram she'd been studying. I made some calls 2 years ago, Jay said. Arizona, New Mexico, Utah. Hit a wall at a P.O. box in Flagstaff. If you want me to try again, I'll try. Switch processed this without any visible reaction for a long moment. Then he moved away from the doorway and took his coffee to the table and sat down across from Petey and looked at the magazine page Ember was pointing at and said, "She's right. That's a twin cam 96. Petey's wrong." Petey said, "That is a personally insulting assessment," and Ember looked at Switch with what was beginning to be recognizable as her version of a smile. Small, provisional, the smile of someone testing whether smiling was safe before committing to it. And the morning went on. Jace pulled his phone out and called Harland at 8 sharp. "The truck," Harland said on the phone. "Tell me again." Black Ford pickup, 5 to 8 years old, one rear brake light cracked and taped, Nevada plates, partial. First 3 characters looked like 7, 3, something. Driver's window down in 9-degree weather. Sat at the gate for 2.5 minutes, lit up the property, then drove south. South toward Winnemucca or south toward Battle Mountain? South is south, Harland. I don't know which end they were coming from. You get a look at the driver? Arm out the window, short sleeves, tattoos, full sleeve on the left arm from what I could see. Couldn't make the designs. A pause on Harland's end. Jace could hear the ambient sound of the sheriff's department in the morning, desk activity, a radio, someone's coffee cup on a hard surface. You could have called this in last night. I'm calling it in now. There's a difference between, I called you the morning after I found her. I called you when that woman claimed to be her grandmother. I'm calling you now. I'm doing the right things in the right order. A longer pause. I'm not disputing that. Are you running her through missing persons? We ran her through missing persons the same day you brought us in. No match in Nevada, Utah, or California as of last check. I've got requests out to Arizona and Idaho. Nationally, it takes longer. What about the note? Paper and ink, no prints other than yours and faint partials that are probably hers. Too smudged to run. The pin is hardware store standard, sold everywhere. Another pause. Jace, I need you to understand what I'm about to say. Go ahead. If someone left that child on those tracks with the intent you're implying, not despair, not crisis, but deliberate, that changes the scope of what we're looking at. That's not an abandoned child case. That's potentially something else. I know. And if it's something else, then your clubhouse in the middle of the Nevada desert is not the safest location for her. Your county has one emergency foster placement, and it's currently full, Jay said. I asked. Your next option is a group home in Elko that I've looked into, and that I'm telling you now, politely, is not acceptable. The silence on Harland's end had a particular quality to it. Not angry. Something more like the silence of a man recalculating. How do you know about the foster placement? Harland said. I made phone calls. You made... Jace. I'm not circumventing anything. I'm gathering information. There's a difference. You're going to give me a heart attack is what you're going to do. Harland breathed. I've got Paulette Graham calling me about the placement review. I've got media calls. I've got the department asking questions about our relationship with your club given the coverage. And now I've got a truck that was probably casing your property. My morning is extremely full. I appreciate the update, Jay said. That's not why I... Look, keep your eyes open. Write down anything else you see. Plates, times, descriptions. And Jace. A pause. Don't do anything that makes this harder. I don't do things to make things harder. You do things, Harland said carefully, that are completely defensible and still somehow make everything harder. That's your specific skill. I'm asking you to be aware of it. Jace considered this. That's fair. Good morning, Harland said, and hung up. The club meeting was called for that evening. Not formally. There were no formal meeting announcements in the Iron Vultures, because formal announcements required an organizational infrastructure that implied permanence and hierarchy in ways most of them were constitutionally resistant to. But Jace said we need to talk tonight after dinner, and everyone understood what that meant and was in the common room by 12 men. The wood stove running hot, the neon sign doing its buzzing outside. Ember asleep in the bunk room, door open, hallway lamp on, coffee on the bar. Nobody with a drink in front of them yet, which was a signal in itself. When there was real business, the drinks waited. Jay stood near the stove and gave them what he had. The truck. Harlan's call. His own assessment of the gap between abandonment and disposal and what he thought that gap meant. Paulette Graham, and the placement review, and the timeline. The media attention, and the particular way that attention had, in his read of similar situations, a tendency to attract people who were looking for information about where a child was and what her situation looked like. He gave them all of it without framing it, without telling them how to think about it, because they were not men who responded well to being told how to think, and he knew the shape of his own crew. When he finished, there was a silence that lasted long enough to be a real silence, and not just a gap. Denny spoke first. "You think she was placed there?" "I think the details are inconsistent with a spontaneous act," Jace said. "The newspaper in the shoes tells me someone prepared her for travel. The blanket tells me someone intended to protect her from the immediate cold. The note tells me the intent was terminus, but not temporary, not a cry for help, a statement of final disposition." "Someone sent a 5-year-old to die and packed her shoes first," Petey said. His voice was very flat. "That's one way to read it." "That's the only way to read it." Rodrigo, switch, leaned forward from the armchair. "She knows something." The room shifted slightly. Jace looked at him. "Go ahead." "She said she wasn't supposed to talk about where she lived." "That's not fear. That's instruction. Someone told her specifically to not talk about it. You tell a kid that when the information is dangerous, when the information could come back to you." He paused. "Whoever left her there wasn't in crisis. They were managing a liability." The word hit the room differently on different faces. Goose's expression went somewhere still and specific that Jace recognized as the place Goose went when he was deciding how far he was willing to go in a given direction. Denny looked at the floor. Petey looked at the hallway toward Ember's door. "So what is she?" said a man named Cal Rourke from the back of the room. Cal was 49 years old, former Army infantry, and had joined the Vultures 3 years ago following a divorce and a DUI that had cost him his CDL and his livelihood in the same 6-month period. He was not the most verbal member of the club, but when he spoke, it was usually the thing nobody else wanted to say. Evidence? A witness? What does a 5-year-old know that gets her put on train tracks? "I don't know yet," Jay said. "But you're sure she knows something?" "I'm sure someone thought she did." "That's the same thing for our purposes," Cal said. He wasn't being aggressive. He was being precise, which was how Cal worked. And if someone thought she was worth disposing of, then someone's going to come for her once they know she's alive. The fire popped. The neon buzzed. Somewhere in the hallway, the lamp flickered once and stabilized. "Which brings us to the meeting," Goose said. He was looking at Jace steadily. "Which brings us to the meeting," Jace said. "You're asking us to hold the line," Goose said. "I'm telling you what I know and what I think. What you decide to do with it is up to you." "Don't do that," Goose said. Not angry, just direct. "Don't make it a democracy when you already know what you want." The room was very quiet. Jace held Goose's eyes. The two men had been through enough together that silence between them had texture. You could read what kind of silence it was the way you could read weather. This one was not hostile. It was something closer to an old argument that had been had before in different forms and never fully resolved. "What I want," Jace said carefully, "and what I'm asking the club to take on are different things. What I want is personal. What I'm asking requires all of you." "Difference being what exactly?" Goose said. "Difference being that what I want is probably going to cost something, and I don't get to decide the cost for people who didn't start this." Goose looked at him for a long moment. "You found her." "I found her." "You brought her here." "I brought her here." "Then whatever this becomes is already something you started," Goose said. "The rest of us picked it up when we didn't ask you to stop. You don't get to hand it back now and call it democratic." A pause. "I'm not handing it back." "Then say what you're actually saying." The fire popped again. Jace looked at the room, not at one face, but at all of them, the particular sweep of the room that took in the accumulated damage and the accumulated loyalty, and the specific way 12 men who had made difficult choices in difficult circumstances for most of their lives looked when they were prepared to make another one. "Someone's going to come for her," he said. "Maybe the truck is reconnaissance. Maybe it's something else. Maybe Harlan figures it out and it stops at law enforcement level and none of the rest of this matters. But if it doesn't stop there, if someone decides they need her gone and decides we're not a deterrent, just an inconvenience, I need to know we're in agreement about what that means." The room sat with it. Cal Rourke said from the back, "You're asking if we fight for her. I'm asking if you understand what staying means." "Same question," Cal said. Jace didn't argue that. The silence that followed lasted long enough for each man in the room to have whatever private conversation he needed to have with himself. These were not men who made commitments lightly. They had all made commitments lightly at various points in their earlier lives and had learned the weight of that lightness in ways they carried permanently. When they committed to something now, it came from a different place, denser, slower to warm, but harder to extinguish once lit. Petey spoke first, which surprised nobody and surprised everybody simultaneously, because Petey was the youngest and the least damaged on the surface, and the one who occasionally surprised you by seeing the clearest. "She drew us on the wall," he said simply. Nobody responded to that directly. But the shape of the room changed. Goose said, "We're in." And the way he said it, not to Jace, to the room, made it something different from one man's endorsement. 3 days later, the first fracture appeared. It came from Denny Hogue, which was the last place Jace would have predicted it, because Denny was steady and precise, and did not do things impulsively or with drama. He came to Jace in the garage at 10 in the morning while Jace was doing a valve adjustment on his Harley, the kind of mechanical work that Jace used the way other men used alcohol or distance, as a way of being somewhere that required all of him and left no room for the alternative. Denny sat on a workbench with his coffee and watched him work for a while without speaking. This was not unusual. Then he said, "I need to say something." "Go ahead." "Not going to be what you want to hear." "Okay." Denny looked at his coffee. He was a lean, careful man who had come to directness late in life, after years of what he described on rare occasions as systematic indirection in the service of people who hadn't deserved his misdirection. "I've been thinking about what Switch said, about her being a liability, about her knowing something. And I think we're getting ahead of the information." He paused. "We have a child, an unknown background, a note, and a truck that parked on a road. That's what we have. The rest is inference." Jace set down the wrench and looked at him. "I'm not saying your inference is wrong," Denny said. "I'm saying we made a commitment in that room based on your read of the situation. And your read might be right, but it might be coming from somewhere other than what's in front of us." The garage was cold. The kind of cold that settled into concrete floors and stayed there. The kind that made your hands ache if you weren't moving them. Outside, the wind had picked up and was moving a line of dust across the gravel between the garage and the back of the diner. "Say the rest of it," Jace said. Denny looked at him directly. "You haven't slept in 5 days." "I've slept." "Not really. Goose told me. You're taking double shifts on watch and not logging it." "Goose talks too much." "Goose is worried." A pause. "We're all worried. About her, yes. But also about you." He let that sit for a moment. "Jace, you've got a look right now that I've seen before. Not on you, on other men. The look that comes before someone does something that can't be undone because they decided the situation required it before they had all the facts." The wind moved across the gravel. The neon sign around the front of the building buzzed faintly, audible even back here because the wind carried everything in the desert. "She asked me again this morning if I was going to give her back," Jace said. Denny was quiet. Not accusatory, not scared, just checking. Like she checks every morning, like it's a variable she has to account for before she can do anything else. He picked up the wrench and set it down again. She shouldn't have to check that. 5 years old and she's already built checking into her morning routine because that's what experience has taught her to do. "I know," Denny said, "so don't tell me I'm reading into it." "I'm not telling you you're reading into it," Denny said quietly. "I'm telling you that the thing you're feeling about her is real, and it's justified, and it's also the thing that might get you, and by extension the rest of us, into a situation that hurts her worse than whatever she's come from." He paused. "That's all. I needed to say it." Jace looked at him for a long moment. Denny held the look without flinching, which was the specific quality that made Denny trustworthy. He didn't look away from things just because they were uncomfortable, and he didn't say things he didn't mean. "Noted," Jace said. "That's it? Noted? What else do you want?" "I want you to sleep." "I'll sleep when I know the perimeter's solid." Denny stood up from the workbench. He put his coffee cup on the steel shelf above the tool rack. A small, deliberate placement, the gesture of a man completing a thing before he moves. "The perimeter's as solid as 12 men who haven't slept enough can make it," he said. "At some point you have to trust that it's enough and get horizontal." He walked to the garage door and stopped. "I'm not against this," he said, his back to Jace. "What you said in that meeting, I voted yes, same as everyone else. I just need you to still be functional when things get hard. Because they're going to get hard." He left. Jace stood in the cold garage and looked at the half-adjusted engine and breathed and didn't pick up the wrench for a while. The truck came back on the fifth night. Not the same position. This time it was parked further down the road, past the visible sight line from the front window, tucked against the scrub brush on the road shoulder where the county road bent slightly before crossing under the overpass. Goose spotted it on his 3 a.m. shift, not from the window, but from the roof, which he'd taken to checking because he was Goose and thoroughness was the only mode he operated in. He woke Jace at 3:15 by putting a hand on his shoulder once. No words. Jace was awake between the first and second. He followed Goose to the back door and they went out into the 9-degree dark and around the north side of the building to the roof ladder. And Goose went first and pointed and Jace saw it. The faint heat signature of an idling engine in the cold air, the exhaust plume barely visible above the scrub line, and the dark shape of the truck body against the slightly less dark shape of the sky. "How long?" Jace said. Just his breath. Barely sound. Goose held up 2 fingers. 2 minutes before he'd come for Jace. "Same truck?" Goose lifted one shoulder, couldn't confirm at this distance and angle, but it was the same make of shape, the same behavior pattern, and behavior patterns were more diagnostic than plate numbers in Jace's experience. They stayed on the roof for 40 minutes. The truck didn't move. It sat there like something breathing, patient and dark. And the patience of it was the most unsettling part. Not aggression, not approach, just presence. The deliberate communication of, "I know where you are." At 3:55, it pulled out and drove north and disappeared. Jace called Harland at 6 a.m., gave him the new information, position, timing, duration, direction of departure. Harland listened without interrupting. "I'm going to put a unit on the county road overnight," Harland said when he was done. "Can't promise it every night. We're not staffed for it, but I can do it intermittently." "Intermittent is better than nothing." "Do you have a sense of what they want?" "Not yet," Jace said, "but they're not escalating to action. They're watching. That tells me they're uncertain." "Uncertain about what?" "About what we know. About what she's told us. About whether we're a threat to them or just a complication." He paused. "Right now, we're a complication. I want to keep it that way until I know more." Harlan was quiet for a moment. "Jace, if this is what it looks like, then it's going to come to law enforcement eventually, and I'm going to hand you everything I have. I know that. I need you to mean that. I mean it. Because if I find out later that you sat on information, I'm not sitting on information. I'm gathering it. The moment I have something actionable, you'll have it first." Another pause. "The placement review is in 4 days." "I know. Graham's going to recommend transitional foster pending further investigation. You know that, right? She doesn't have a choice. The situation is too uncertain, and you're not a licensed placement. I know what she's going to recommend. And I'm going to be in that meeting, and I'm going to say what I have to say, and we'll see." Harlan made a sound that was not quite a sigh and not quite something else. The sound of a man who respected someone's intentions and was deeply uncertain about their outcomes. "I'll see you in 4 days. Out." The next afternoon, Jace drove to Winnemucca alone. He left Goose in charge of the rotation, told Denny where he was going without saying why, and took the county road north to the highway in his truck instead of the Harley because the Harley was visible and he wanted to be invisible today. The drive was an hour in thin afternoon winter light, the basin flat and pale on both sides of the highway. the mountains to the east showing snow on their upper faces. He was going to see a man named Frank Calloway. Frank Calloway was 63 years old and had been practicing family law in Winnemucca for 28 years and had never once, in Jace's observation of 4 years of intermittent interaction, done anything that could be described as fast. He was deliberate to the point of geological patience, and his office smelled of old coffee and case files and the specific dust of a space that had been occupied by serious work for a long time. He had represented 3 Iron Vultures members in various legal proceedings over the past 4 years, and whatever his private opinions of the club were, he kept them private, which was the quality Jace valued most in a professional. Frank listened to the situation from beginning to present in his leather desk chair, with his hands folded and his face completely still, the way he listened to everything without any of the tells that lesser listeners used to communicate that they were engaged. When Jace finished, Frank was quiet for a full 20 seconds. "The note," Frank said. "I have it." "Photographs?" "Harland has photographs. I have the physical." "You should let Harland have the physical." "I know, I'll bring it to the placement meeting." Frank nodded slowly. "The placement review. Graham is going to recommend transitional foster." "That's what Harland said." "She's right to," Frank said. "Procedurally, she has no other option. You're not licensed. The club is not a certified environment. The investigation is open. She'd be professionally negligent to recommend anything else." "So what do I argue?" Frank looked at him over his folded hands. "You argue for licensed emergency placement with the club members as approved contacts. You argue for a guardian ad litem appointment, someone who represents the child's interests specifically, not the system's interests. You argue that the child's demonstrated emotional stability in your care is a factor the court should weigh." He paused. "And then you start the licensing process. Today. Not after the meeting. Today." Jace looked at him. "The licensing process takes months, yes, but the application being in progress changes the conversation. It demonstrates intent. It demonstrates that you understand the requirements and are actively meeting them. Graham is a professional. She responds to professional process. She's going to look at my record. Yes. 2019, 18 months served of 36, nonviolent. That's not disqualifying automatically. It's a factor. It's a manageable factor with the right framing. And the club." Frank was quiet for a moment. "The club is both your strongest argument and your most significant liability. The men who are there, their backgrounds, their records, each one is a variable that the system is going to evaluate individually and collectively. You can't control that." "No. What you can control is the story you tell. And the story you tell has to be true, or it falls apart the first time someone looks behind it." He paused. "Is it a good story?" Jace thought about Goose and Switch and Petey and Denny and Cal and the others. He thought about the drawing on the wall. He thought about Switch's voice saying her name, Vanessa, in the hallway at 6 in the morning. "It's a true story," Jace said. "Then tell it," Frank said. "That's all you can do." He drove back to Ridgeline in the early dark. The highway was empty and the desert on both sides of it was the deep blue of winter dusk. The mountains to the east gone to silhouette. He drove without the radio because he needed the quiet, or what passed for quiet at highway speed with the heater running and his thoughts at their current volume. He was thinking about what Frank had said about the story and about what was true. He was thinking about the truck and about Denny's words in the garage. He was thinking about Ember checking every morning to confirm she was still there, still safe, still not given back. He was thinking about a conversation he'd had with Layla 4 years into the marriage, the one where she'd asked him what he was afraid of, and he'd said nothing because the truth was the wrong shape to put into words at that moment, or he'd told himself it was. The truth had been that he was afraid of becoming someone's reason and then failing them. That he'd been everyone's reason at various points, his unit, his brother, his marriage, and he had a specific record with that role that he was not prepared to repeat. He had not told her that. He had said nothing, and she had looked at him for a long time with the expression of a woman running out of a particular kind of patience, and then she had let it go. And 4 months later, she had not let it go so much as let go of the relationship that the moment existed inside. And he had understood, and he had not argued it because he had understood. He thought about Ember's hand on his forearm that first night, the grip around his flannel collar, the small, deliberate weight of it. He thought about the word unwanted and what he'd felt when he read it, and how he'd folded the note and put it in his pocket, and that had been the first moment he understood now. Not the finding, but the folding. The decision to hold on to it, to keep it close, to not let it be just a piece of evidence in a system that would file it and categorize it and lose it in a drawer somewhere while it figured out what to do next. He was 20 minutes from Ridgeline when his phone rang through the truck's speakers. Goose's number. He answered. "You need to come back now," Goose said. The tone of his voice was the specific tone that meant the calculation had changed. Not panic. Goose didn't panic, but alert. The voice of a man who had seen the shape of something and needed Jace in the room. "What happened?" Jace said. "Someone's here," Goose said. "A man. He came to the gate 20 minutes ago. Says he's her father." The highway ran straight ahead through the dark, the headlights eating up the white center line mile by mile. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Jace said. "Nobody talks to him until I get there." "He's not asking to talk," Goose said. "He's asking to come in." "What did you tell him?" "I told him to wait." "He waiting?" A pause. "So far, but Jace..." Another pause, longer. "He's not alone. There are 2 other men with him, parked behind the truck." A beat. "The truck's black." Jace's hands tightened on the wheel. The highway kept coming. "Keep the gate closed," he said. "Keep everyone inside. I'm 20 minutes out." He pressed the accelerator down and the engine answered, and the desert dark went past on both sides like walls closing in, and he drove toward whatever was waiting at his gate with the particular interior stillness of a man who had finally stopped calculating and started deciding. He saw the headlights from half a mile out. Not one set. 3. 2 parked behind the first, as Goose had said, but parked in a way that told him something immediately, because the positioning was not incidental. The 2 vehicles behind were angled slightly outward from the one in front, the natural geometry of men who had learned to cover flanks without being told, military pattern or something that had learned from it. He pulled in through the back service road and came through the rear of the property and entered through the kitchen door, and the first thing he registered was the temperature of the room. The particular heated-up tension of 12 men in an enclosed space who had been waiting for something and were ready in the particular way they got ready when they understood the range of possibilities. Goose was at the front window. Petey was in the hallway outside Ember's door with his arms folded and an expression that Jace had never seen on Petey's face before. Not anger exactly, but something below anger, something that had gotten past the young man's general warmth and lodged somewhere harder. Denny was at the bar with his coffee, which he hadn't drunk. Switch was in the armchair and hadn't moved, but his posture was different from its usual stillness, the stillness of a spring, not a stone. Jace went to the front window. The truck was black. The other 2 vehicles were pickup trucks as well. One dark blue, one silver, both older, both running. He could see 3 men in the pooled headlight illumination near the gate, one at the front and 2 back and slightly wide, and the one at the front was standing with his hands in his jacket pockets and his weight on his back foot. The specific posture of a man who was comfortable being waited on, who was used to being the one other people came to. He was medium height, thick through the shoulders, somewhere in his 40s. Work-worn face visible even at this distance in the light. The kind of face that had been outdoors and hard used for a long time and wore that history without apology. Jace looked at him for a long moment. "How long since he got here?" he said to Goose without looking away from the window. 32 minutes. Knocked on the gate. Said he was looking for his daughter. I got him on the intercom, told him to wait. He waited. He say a name? Hers or his? His name is Wade Mercer. Didn't say hers, said, my little girl. Goose paused. Jace, he's been here before. I can feel it. Yeah, Jace said. I know. He thought of the truck on the first night, the second night, the deliberate patience of it, the watching. He thought of Ember saying, I'm not supposed to talk about that in the flat voice of a child following instruction. He thought of the safety pin and the newspaper in the shoes and the word written with the specific precision of someone who had decided. He straightened, turned, found the room watching him. I need everyone in here to understand something before I go out there, he said. His voice was even and controlled and carried the full weight of his attention. Whatever is said at that gate, however this goes, nobody moves unless I say so. Nobody. The room held the instruction. "Goose," he said. "Here. You're on Ember. Stay with her. Whatever happens outside, your one job is that hallway." Goose moved without a word. Jace walked to the front door. He paused with his hand on the knob and breathed once, slow and deliberate, the breath of a man putting something very specific into the bottom of himself where he could get to it quickly if he needed it, and where it wouldn't interfere with what came before it. He thought of Ember. He thought of her checking every morning. He thought of the fold of the note in his inside pocket, carried every day since he'd picked it up off that crossing. He opened the door and walked out into the cold. The gravel was frozen solid underfoot, crunching with each step, and the neon sign threw its red and blue across the frost as he walked toward the gate. The wind was down to almost nothing now, which made the silence of the desert full and present, the kind of silence that amplified small sounds. The creak of his jacket, the exhaust of the idling trucks, the faint click of the gate latch as he approached it. He stopped at the gate with the chain link between them and looked at the man on the other side. Wade Mercer looked back at him. Up close, his face was harder than the distance had suggested. Not just work-worn, but in some more fundamental way worn down. The face of someone who had done things that left a residue. His eyes were pale and set close and had the specific quality of eyes that had learned to assess people very quickly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Mercer said, "I'm looking for my daughter." His voice was flat and low and had a cadence from somewhere south of here, the open vowels of the high desert southwest, a voice that had been raised on dust and distance. Jace said, "Who told you she was here?" "News," Mercer said. "Story said a motorcycle club found a little girl on the tracks near Ridgeline. Said she was being kept here." He paused. "My daughter went missing 11 days ago." Jace looked at him. "You file a report?" A slight hesitation, so small that a less practiced observer would have missed it entirely. "I was looking on my own first." 11 days, Jace said. "You waited 11 days to come here. Story ran 6 days ago." "I was on the road." "Where?" "Does it matter?" "If your daughter's been missing 11 days and the first person you ask for help is a motorcycle club instead of the sheriff's department," Jace said, "then yes, it matters." The two men behind Mercer had moved slightly. Not forward, just a degree of reorientation, the unconscious adjustment of men who sensed the conversation going in a direction that might require them. Jace registered it the way he registered everything in his peripheral field right now, cataloged, not acted on. Mercer's jaw tightened. "I want to see her. There's a child here," Jace said. "The sheriff's department is handling the investigation. If you have information about her identity, you need to take it to Deputy Harland at Lander County. That's the process." "I'm not here for process," Mercer said. I'm here for my daughter." "Then go through Harland," Jace said. "I want to see her now." "That's not going to happen." The silence between them had weight. Mercer was looking at him through the chain link with those pale, close-set eyes, and the calculation running behind them was visible if you knew how to read it. Not the calculation of someone processing grief or urgency, but the calculation of someone determining the shape of an obstacle and what it would take to go through or around it. "You don't have any right to keep her from me," Mercer said. "You don't have any documentation that she's yours," Jace said. "No paperwork, no filing, nothing in the sheriff's system. Until there's documentation and until law enforcement confirms it, nobody's taking that child anywhere." Mercer was very still for a moment. Then he said, very quietly, with the particular quiet of a man who is accustomed to not needing to raise his voice to be taken seriously, "I know who you are. I know what you are. You think a judge is going to leave a child with a bunch of tattooed felons when a father comes forward? I think," Jay said with equal quiet, "that when a father comes forward, he comes forward to the proper authorities with documentation and a genuine history of caring for his child. And I think that a man who drove past this gate twice in the dark and waited 11 days to ask a single question is not that." The silence that followed was different from the ones before it. Mercer's face did something, not much, just a fractional rearrangement of the muscles around his eyes, there and gone. And Jace felt it the way he felt a change in wind before he could hear it, a shift in the air that contained information about what was coming. "You're making a mistake," Mercer said. "Call Harland," Jace said. "That's the end of this conversation." He held the man's eyes for another 3 seconds, then turned and walked back toward the clubhouse. His back was completely exposed, and he was aware of every inch of it, and he walked steadily and without hurry, because hurry communicated calculation, and calculation communicated fear, and fear was something you could not afford to show to the man currently standing at your gate, deciding whether he was a problem. He was 5 steps from the door when Mercer's voice came across the gravel. "She sees things she shouldn't have," Mercer said. "That's why she can't stay with you." Jay stopped. The neon hummed. The frozen gravel held still. The desert dark lay over everything like a second sky. He did not turn around. He stood with his hand reaching for the door, and he let the words settle, and he breathed once, and he filed them in the same place. He filed the note and the newspaper and the safety pin and the morning checks. And what they told him when filed together was something he had suspected and was now certain of. And the certainty of it was cold and clear and final. He went inside. He closed the door behind him. The room was in its held-breath state, 12 men waiting, and he crossed to the bar and picked up the phone and dialed Harlan's cell directly, not the department line. Harlan picked up on the second ring. "Wade Mercer," Jay said. "He's at my gate right now with 2 other men. He's claiming to be Ember's father. He just told me she sees things she shouldn't have." He paused 1 beat. "Get here." The silence on Harlan's end lasted exactly 4 seconds. "I'm on my way," Harlan said. Jay set the phone down. He walked to the hallway. Goose was at Ember's door, exactly where he'd been told to be. Inside the room, through the open door, Ember was awake. She'd heard the vehicles, probably, or heard the change in the building's atmosphere, because children who had lived in uncertain places developed that particular sensitivity early. She was sitting up in the bunk with the blankets pulled around her and her dark eyes wide, and her face in the expression of someone waiting to learn what kind of thing this was. Jace went to the doorway. He crouched down to her level, 1 hand on the door frame. "There's a man at the gate," he said. His voice was very steady. "He says he's your father. His name is Wade Mercer." The change on Ember's face was not dramatic. It was not a scream or a flinch or a collapse. It was much quieter and much worse than any of those. It was the expression of a child who has been holding a very specific fear at a manageable distance and has just been told the distance has closed. Her face went the particular still of deep, practiced terror. The kind that didn't need to perform itself because it had been necessary and real for long enough that it had become structural. Her hands found the edge of the blanket and gripped. "Is he coming in?" she whispered. "No," Jay said. "Does he know I'm here?" "He knows. But he's not coming through that gate. I promise you." She looked at him for a long moment with those dark eyes, and the fear in them was the most specific thing he had ever seen on a human face. Not fear of darkness or strangers or the unknown, but fear of a known thing, a named thing. A thing she had already lived through and been marked by, and had no context to understand except through what it had already done to her. And beneath the fear, almost invisible, almost gone, hope, the smallest, most defended thing. The hope that the promise was real. "Okay," she whispered. He stayed crouched in the doorway until her hands loosened on the blanket. Then he straightened and looked at Goose. Goose met his eyes. Neither of them needed to say anything. Outside, beyond the gate, Wade Mercer's truck sat idling in the dark, and the desert held its cold and patient silence. And inside the clubhouse, every man who had voted yes in that room 3 days ago understood now, with the specific clarity of a thing become real, exactly what they had voted for and exactly what it was going to require. The law was 20 minutes away. The night was already changed, and the child at the center of it had just confirmed, in the only way that mattered, that whatever she had seen and whatever she had been told not to say was something someone was prepared to come a long way through the cold Nevada dark to make sure she never said. The gate held. For now. Harlan arrived in 19 minutes, not 20. 19, which meant he'd been moving before he hung up the phone, which meant he'd understood the weight of those 4 words. She sees things she shouldn't, in the same register Jace had. 1 cruiser, no lights, no siren, which was also a choice that communicated something. This was not a welfare call. This was something that required arriving without announcing itself to the men at the gate. Wade Mercer was still there when Harlan pulled up behind him. Jace watched it from the front window. Harlan got out with his hand loose at his side and his posture at the specific angle of a law enforcement officer who has not yet decided what a situation is and is reserving that decision while he collects information. He spoke to Mercer for 4 minutes. Jace could not hear the words, but he could read the geometry. Mercer's body language moved through several positions, initially confident, then controlled, then the particular stillness of a man deciding how much to give away. At the 4-minute mark, Harlan walked to the gate and Jace opened it. They stood in the gap between the gateposts with the cold coming off the desert in waves and the neon throwing its colors across the frost on the gravel. "He's got a photo," Harlan said quietly. His voice was controlled. "Cell phone. Girl who could be Ember, could be another child entirely. Bad light, angle's wrong, she's younger in it. He's claiming she's been with him since birth, mother deceased, no other family. He file anything? Not in Nevada. I've got someone running him right now." A pause. "Jace, he's not wrong that a biological claim, even unverified, creates a legal complication. He told me she sees things she shouldn't." Harlan was still for a moment. "I heard you the first time." "What does that mean to you?" "It means I want to know what those things are," Harlan said, "and it means I'm very interested in his record right now." He looked over his shoulder at the trucks idling on the road. "I'm going to ask him to come to the department voluntarily for a formal statement. If he refuses, I've got less than I need to hold him. And if he agrees, then I have him in a room and I start asking the questions that matter." Harlan looked back at Jace. "Keep the child inside. Keep your men calm. Do not... Jace, I need to hear you say this. Do not go near those trucks." "I won't go near the trucks." "Say it like you mean it." "I mean it." Harlan held his eyes for a moment in the way of a man taking a reading he intended to hold on to. Then he went back through the gate, and Jace watched him walk to Mercer and speak, and Mercer stood very still while he listened, and after a moment Mercer nodded once. The 2 men in the back trucks didn't move. Mercer got in his truck. The others followed. Harlan's cruiser fell in behind them, and the 3 sets of taillights moved north down the county road and diminished and disappeared. The desert was empty again. Jace stood at the gate for a moment in the cold and the quiet and the neon light and breathed. Then he went inside to sit with Ember. What? She was still awake. Goose had stayed in the doorway, and she'd stayed in the bunk, and they'd apparently arrived at a mutual silent accommodation of each other's presence, because when Jace came in, she was sitting cross-legged with the blankets around her shoulders, and Goose was leaning against the doorframe with his coffee, and neither of them had apparently found the need to fill the space between them with anything. Goose met Jace's eyes over her head and raised his chin slightly. The question. Jace gave him a slow nod, handled, for now, and Goose pushed off the doorframe and moved down the hallway with the careful, sound-minimal movement of a man who understood when he was the third party. Jace sat on the edge of the bunk. Ember looked at him. "He left," Jace said. "She absorbed this." "Is he coming back?" "I don't know. The deputy took him to answer questions. That's good." "Questions about what?" He looked at her carefully. "About you. About where you were before." She was very still. In the low light of the hallway lamp, her face was in partial shadow, the dark eyes catching what light there was, and she had the expression she got when she was running an internal calculation. The small furrow between her brows, the almost invisible movement of her lower lip. "You don't have to tell me anything," he said. "Not tonight. Not ever, if you don't want to." She looked at him for a long moment. "He said I see things." "I heard. He said that before. When he was..." She stopped. Her hands found the blanket edge and held it, not in the terror grip of earlier, but in the steadying grip of someone choosing to stay present rather than retreat. "He said I was too little to know what I saw. He said I'd forget." Jace said nothing. He held still and let the words exist in the room without pressing on them. "I didn't forget," she said quietly. "I know," he said. "There were other girls," she said, "at the house. I didn't know their names. They weren't supposed to talk to me." She paused. "They were scared." The room was very still. The lamp in the hallway, the distant, inaudible desert outside the insulation and the drywall, and the years. "How many?" Jace said. His voice was completely even. He was working very hard to keep it that way. "I don't know. Different ones. They came and then they weren't there." She looked at her hands on the blanket. Wade said they went somewhere better, but they cried when the trucks came. Jace breathed in through his nose and out through his mouth and did not move and did not let anything reach his face that shouldn't be there. "Okay," he said. "Okay, I hear you. Is that bad?" she asked. "What I said. It's important," he said. "It's very important." He met her eyes. "You did nothing wrong, not a single thing. Do you understand that?" She looked at him for a moment with the particular look of a child evaluating a statement against their own existing record of what adults said versus what turned out to be true. Then she nodded. "Try to sleep," he said. "I'm going to be right outside." He stood and walked to the doorway and stopped with his hand on the frame and his back to her, and he stood there for exactly 3 seconds with his eyes closed and his jaw tight, and something moving through his chest that he did not have a clean word for. Not anger, though anger was in it. Not grief, though grief was in it too. Something older than either of those. Something that had been put in him a long time ago in a different desert, on a different continent, when he had stood in rooms and seen what people did to other people and had filed it under the category of things that had to be survived and moved past rather than held on to, because holding on to it was not compatible with functioning. He was holding on to it now. He moved down the hallway. He told Goose first because Goose needed to know the scope, and because Goose, of all the men in the building, had the deepest operational experience with situations where the categories changed mid-mission. He told him in the kitchen in a voice below conversation level with the exhaust fan running to cover it, and he told him exactly what Ember had said, word for word, without framing or interpretation. Goose listened without moving. When Jace finished, Goose set his coffee cup on the counter very slowly, very deliberately, with the particular care of a man who is managing what his hands want to do. "Multiple girls," Goose said. "Trucks." That's what she said. "Coming and going. Afraid." "Yes." Goose was quiet for a moment. His face had gone to the place it went, that still, specific place, and Jace watched him arrive at his conclusion and felt him arrive at it. "This is not a custody dispute," Goose said. "No," Jace said, "it's not." "How long has Harlan had him?" Jace checked the time. 40 minutes. "You know what he's sitting across from?" "He will when I call him." Jace paused. "I need to think about how I do that. What I tell him. Because the moment I tell him what she said, she becomes a material witness. And a material witness to something like this gets protected," Goose said. "Gets moved," Jace said. "There's a difference." The kitchen held the silence between those two words, protected and moved. What the system meant when it used those words and what they actually produced. "Can Frank help?" Goose said. "I'm calling Frank as soon as I call Harlan." Goose nodded slowly. He picked up his coffee cup and then set it back down without drinking from it. "The other girls," he said. "I know. If this is what it looks like, those other girls are—" "I know, Goose." A pause. The exhaust fan ran. Somewhere outside, the wind had picked up slightly and moved across the roof with a sound like something breathing. "Call Harlan," Goose said. "Right now. Whatever happens to us in the middle of this, the girl, the hearing, all of it, that's secondary." "I know that too." "Say it like you believe it." Jace looked at him. "I believe it. I've believed it since the tracks." Goose met his eyes and held them for a long moment in the way of a man confirming something he needed confirmed. Then he nodded and stepped back, and Jace went to the phone. "Bonsoir." Harlan's voice on the phone had a different quality than it had had earlier. Not louder, not faster. Harlan didn't operate in those registers. But underneath the professional control was something tighter, a tension in the pauses that hadn't been there before. Jace understood immediately that the 40 minutes in the room with Wade Mercer had given Harlan something, and what it had given him had changed the shape of his evening. "I was about to call you," Harlan said. "What did he tell you?" "Not much directly, but his record, Jace." A pause. "He's got a sheet in 3 states, assault in Arizona dismissed, trafficking adjacent charge in New Mexico 2019 pled to a misdemeanor, 2 open welfare complaints in different counties, both inconclusive." Another pause. "He's clean on paper mostly, but the pattern." "She told me about other girls," Jace said, "at the house where she lived, different ones, coming and going in trucks. Afraid." The silence on Harlan's end lasted longer than Jace expected. "She's 5, Harlan said finally. "I know what age she is. What she describes, a 5-year-old's account of what she observed, is exactly what she observed," Jace said. "She's not interpreting it. She doesn't have the framework to interpret it. She's describing what she saw with direct sensory accuracy. She said the girls cried when the trucks came. She said she didn't know their names because they weren't supposed to talk to her. She said they came, and then they weren't there." Another long silence. "I need that on record," Harlan said. "Properly. With a forensic interviewer. Someone trained in child witness protocol. Not you, not your people, a professional in a proper environment. I know. That means she comes to the department. I know that too. Tonight, Jace, this can't wait. If Mercer gets wind that he's sitting in your building, I have nothing to hold him on. He came voluntarily and he can leave voluntarily, and the moment I tell him he can't leave, I need cause that I do not currently have." The frustration in Harlan's voice was controlled but audible. The frustration of a good man inside a procedural framework that moved slower than the thing it was trying to contain. "I can stall him another 20, 30 minutes. Then he walks." "Then he walks," Jace said. "Jace, you and I both know that if Mercer walks tonight, you won't have him again unless you can build enough for a warrant. And building enough for a warrant starts with her testimony. So get your forensic interviewer on the phone, and I'll have her there in 40 minutes, and we're going to do this right." He paused. "And Harlan, whatever this is, whatever she's describing, it doesn't stop with Mercer. One man with a history and a pattern, and a 5-year-old he tried to make disappear, doesn't operate alone." The silence on the line was very specific. "I know," Harlan said. "So when you make the calls tonight, and you're going to make calls tonight, make sure they go to the right people, federal level. Because county isn't going to be enough for this." Harlan breathed. "I already made one call," he said quietly. "While Mercer was in the waiting room, I wanted a second opinion on the record." A pause. "Jace, there are people who are going to want to talk to you directly, not just about Ember, about what you've seen, the truck visits, the timing, the note." "I know. This is about to get significantly larger than a custody hearing." "I know," Jace said. "Get the interviewer ready. We'll be there." He hung up. He stood at the bar with his hand still on the phone and looked at the counter and breathed. The neon sign buzzed outside. The wood stove clicked. The building held its nighttime sounds around him, the small structural language of an old place in cold weather. Then the back door opened and Denny came in from outside with his jacket dark from something and his face wrong. Not wrong in an emotional sense. Denny's face was almost never wrong in an emotional sense, because Denny had spent considerable years learning to control what his face did. Wrong in the sense of pale. Wrong in the sense of the color that came to a face when the body had received information that required rapid redistribution of resources. Jace was at the back door in 3 steps. "What?" he said. Denny's jaw worked for a moment. "Back fence line," he said. "South corner. I was checking the perimeter." He stopped. Started again. "Jace. Someone cut the fence." "When?" "Recently. Wires clean cut, no rust on the edges, no weather on the cut. And there are tracks." He paused. "Boot tracks. Coming in. And they don't go back out the same way." The cold from the open door was significant and immediate, and Jace felt it move through his flannel like a statement. "How long ago were you at the south corner?" he said. 40 minutes. Before Harlan arrived." "The fence was intact then?" "I'd have flagged it." 40 minutes. Harlan arrived. Mercer's truck sat at the gate, drawing every eye and every calculation toward the road, toward the north, toward the visible threat. And in the 40 minutes that the visible threat occupied the full attention of 12 men, something had come through the back. "I need everyone up," Jace said. "Right now. Full sweep of the building." Denny was already moving before the sentence finished. His voice went down the hallway. Not loud, controlled, the specific tone that cut through inattention without creating panic. And the building responded within seconds. The sound of men rising and moving with the directed velocity of people who had drilled this kind of response in other contexts. Jace went straight to Ember's room. Goose was there, in the doorway, and he hadn't moved in the 40 minutes since Jace had left him there, which meant whatever had come through the back fence had not made it this far yet. Jace leaned past him and looked at the bunk. Ember was asleep. Actually, asleep. The genuine deep sleep of a child who had exhausted herself against the weight of the evening and finally gone under. One hand tucked under her cheek, the blankets rising and falling with the slow rhythm of it. Jace let out a breath that he hadn't been aware of holding. "What happened?" Goose said quietly. "Back fence, cut, recent, tracks inside the perimeter." Goose's face did the thing. "How many tracks?" "Denny said tracks. Didn't give me a number." He looked at the sleeping child. "I need you on this door. I need you physically on this door." "I haven't left this door." "I know. Stay here." He moved back down the hallway. The sweep took 11 minutes. 11 minutes of 12 men moving through every room, every closet, the garage, the crawl space under the diner, the space behind the bar, the back storage area that held tools and boxes, and the accumulated physical archaeology of 6 years of occupancy. Switch and Cal took the perimeter outside, moving in opposite directions around the building's exterior with flashlights and the particular focused silence of men who understood that the sound they were moving toward might be moving too. They found nothing inside. At the back fence, in the south corner, the tracks in the snow told a story that Jace read on his knees in the flashlight beam, with Denny crouching beside him. 2 sets of boots, different sizes, different treads. They came through the cut section of fence, heading north toward the building. They went about 30 feet in, stopping at a position that had a clear sight line to the back door and the kitchen windows. Then they went east along the fence line to the corner where the fence met the old cinder block wall of the garage. And there the tracks stopped. "Where do they go from here?" Cal said from above him. Jace looked at the garage wall. Old cinder block, decades of weather, a rusted drain pipe running down from the roof line. The snow on top of the cinder block wall was disturbed, a scrape mark through the frost on the block's top edge, fresh. "Up," Jace said. He looked at the roof. Switch was already moving to the ladder on the north face of the garage, the one Goose had used 2 nights ago to spot the truck on the road. He went up fast and quiet, and Jace heard him reach the top and heard the silence after it. The listening silence, the checking silence. "Clear," Switch called down soft. "But they were here." Snow's pressed down. 2 positions, both with sight lines into the main building, south-facing windows. A pause. "Jace, one of these positions looks directly into the bunk room hallway." Jace was still at the fence tracks. He looked at the disturbed snow. He looked at the cut in the fence wire. Clean, professional, the cut of someone who had done this before, in and out of enclosed spaces without invitation. He looked at the boot tracks going in and stopping and the roof above. Someone had been on that roof tonight. During the 40 minutes that the front gate occupied every conscious eye in the building, someone had come through the back fence and gotten onto the roof and looked through the windows and seen inside the building, seen the layout, seen the rooms, seen, possibly, Ember. The calculation assembled itself very quickly and very clearly in Jace's mind, and when it finished assembling, it produced one conclusion that sat there in his sternum like swallowed metal. Mercer at the gate had not been the threat. Mercer at the gate had been the distraction. He stood up from his crouch at the fence line, and the cold air was significant, and the neon sign around the front of the building was a red and blue glow against the dark sky to the north. And the desert lay silent in every direction, and he was very still for a moment in the middle of all of it. Then he went inside and called Harland back. "He needs to not walk," Jace said without preamble. Harland heard the change in his voice. "What happened?" "Someone was on my roof tonight. During the window when you had Mercer in your building. 2 people came through the back fence, got on the roof, surveilled the interior through the windows." He paused. "They were looking for her position in the building. Mercer sent them ahead while he bought time with you." The silence on Harland's end was very brief. "I can hold him on suspicion pending investigation of the fence cutting. It's a stretch, but I can do it for tonight." "Do it." "Jace, what's happening right now? What you're describing. This is not something your club can manage. You understand that." "I understand it. I need you to bring her in. Tonight. Now. Not in 40 minutes. His voice had the flat urgency of a man who had revised his assessment of the situation's speed. "Whatever she told you, whatever those tracks mean, She's the only material evidence of something that has now demonstrated it is willing to conduct surveillance operations to locate her. That makes her a target, Jace. Not a custody case. A target. The words sat in the cold air of the kitchen where Jace was standing with the back door still open slightly and the desert dark beyond it. I'm going to wake her up, Jace said. I'm going to explain what I can, and then I'm going to bring her to you. But Harland... He stopped. Say it, Harland said. She trusts me. Whatever room you put her in tonight, whatever professional you sit across from her, I need to be somewhere she can see me. Not in the room, but visible. Or she's going to shut down and you're going to get nothing. A pause. I can work with that. And Mercer does not see her. Not tonight, not ever, not in a hallway, not across a parking lot. If he sees her, it confirms for him that she's here, and it confirms for whoever was on my roof where she's going. Understood. And Harland, he breathed, make the federal call tonight. Not in the morning, tonight, before Mercer has access to a phone. The pause this time was longer. I already made it, Harland said quietly. 2 hours ago. They're already moving. The back door was still open. The cold came through it steadily. Jace closed it with one hand and the latch caught with a small definitive sound in the kitchen silence. I'll be there in 30 minutes, he said. He hung up and turned to find the room had assembled behind him. Not all 12, but enough. Goose, Denny, Switch, Petey, Cal. Standing in the kitchen doorway and the hallway beyond it, in the particular posture of men who had heard enough to understand the shape of what was next even without the full content. He told them, not everything. There wasn't time for everything, and some of it needed to stay contained for Harland, and for whatever federal conversation was already happening in some office somewhere that Jace would not have access to until someone decided he needed it. But enough. The roof. The surveillance. The federal call. What Harland needed tonight. The kitchen held it in silence. Then Petey said very quietly, she's going to be okay. He said it to nobody in particular. He said it the way people say things that they need to have said regardless of whether they have evidence for them, because the saying creates a small structural fact in the room that wouldn't exist otherwise. Nobody contradicted him. Jace went to wake Ember. She woke with the immediate clarity she always showed. No grogginess, no confusion, full presence from the first second, and she read his face before he said a word. That was the part that stayed with him afterward, because it spoke to something he hadn't fully calculated yet. The specific quickness with which she read adult faces, the practiced speed of it, a child who had learned to read the emotional content of a face approaching her bed in the dark as a matter of survival. He sat on the edge of the bunk. I need to take you somewhere tonight, he said. She was still. Where? The sheriff's office. There's a deputy there named Harland. He's the one I've been calling. He's going to help us figure out the right things. He paused. There's a person there who's good at talking to kids. They're going to ask you some questions. Just about what you told me, what you saw, nothing more than that. She looked at her hands. Will you be there? I'll be somewhere you can see me. Not in the room, but right there. She processed this. The furrow between her brows, the lower lip. Because of Wade, she said. Because of Wade. And because of what you told me about the other girls. She looked up. Her eyes were very steady. I wasn't supposed to say about the girls. I know, but you did. And that was brave. And what happens next, the questions, the deputy, all of it. It happens because you were brave enough to say it. He held her eyes. What you saw matters. You matter. I need you to hold on to that tonight, okay? Whatever room they put you in, whatever questions they ask, you remember that what you know is important and that I am right outside. She looked at him for a long time in the hallway lamplight. This man she had known for 9 days, this scarred and sleepless and careful man who had found her on a railroad track and wrapped her in his jacket and kept every small promise he had made and broken none of the larger ones yet. And she ran whatever calculation she ran in those long looks, and it came down where it had consistently come down. And she nodded. Okay, she said. He helped her put on her shoes, the new ones that Petey had driven to Winnemucca to buy 4 days ago, proper size, no newspaper. She tied them herself with the focused two-handed concentration she brought to everything, and he watched her, and something in his chest moved in a way he didn't try to name. He stood, and she stood, and she put her hand in his, and they walked out through the common room where the remaining men were standing and sitting and occupying the space with their particular version of presence, not performing anything, not posturing, just there, just solid, the way they had been every night since the crossing. She looked at them as she walked through. Switch was in his armchair. He met her eyes and gave her one slow nod, the same kind of nod she gave when she was accepting information and storing it. Cal had his arms folded and his chin up, the military posture, the posture of someone standing post. Petey was near the door, and he was doing the thing where he looked like he had something to say and was making himself not say it. And she looked at him and he gave her the smallest possible version of his usual wide-open smile, tightened down to something that contained the warmth without the noise of it. Denny held the door. Outside, the night was 12 degrees, and the stars were unforgiving, and the desert lay out in all directions in the absolute dark that existed between highway lights. And Jace walked with Ember to his truck and helped her into the cab and got in on the other side and started the engine and let it warm for 30 seconds. She sat in the passenger seat with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the windshield. "Jace," she said. "Yeah, the girls at the house." She paused. "Do you think they're okay?" He looked at the windshield. He looked at the neon sign in the rear-view mirror throwing its colors across the frozen gravel behind them. He thought about what Goose had started to say in the kitchen and what Jace had cut off. If this is what it looks like, those other girls are... And the word that finished that sentence that neither of them had said out loud. He thought about Harlan saying they're already moving, federal level, already moving. "I think people are working very hard right now to make sure they are," he said. Which was true. Which was the only true thing he could say and the only shape of hope that was honest. She nodded. Once. The nod. He put the truck in gear and drove out through the gate and onto the county road heading north, and the clubhouse shrank in the mirror until the neon sign was just a smear of color in the dark, and the desert accepted them into its cold and silent interior. And somewhere behind him, 12 men were standing in a building that had been looked at from a roof by people who knew exactly what they were looking for. And somewhere ahead of him, a deputy was keeping a dangerous man in a room with the thinnest possible legal justification. And somewhere beyond both of those points, federal phones were ringing in offices with fluorescent lights and file cabinets full of cases that looked like this one, and were this one with different names and different states and the same fundamental shape. And sitting beside him in the passenger seat, 5 years old, hands folded in her lap, watching the dark highway with the eyes of someone who had already survived things that should not have been survivable, was the only witness to what any of it actually looked like from the inside. He drove. The heater ran. The highway was empty and straight, and the headlights made a small moving island of visibility in the enormous dark. And Jace Maddox drove through it toward whatever was going to happen next with the specific interior set of a man who has finally stopped calculating the cost and started paying it. And the child beside him rode in the kind of silence that is not empty but full of the particular weight of a person who has told the truth after being told not to and is waiting to find out what that costs. And trusting, provisionally and entirely, the man driving the truck to make sure the cost is one she can survive. 30 miles ahead, in a county building with bad lighting and worse coffee, Wade Mercer was sitting in a room with Harland and not yet knowing that the small girl he had left on a railroad track to be erased by whatever came first, the cold, the train, the desert, had just become the most important person in a federal investigation. And somewhere between the clubhouse and that building, on a dark Nevada highway in the deep of winter, the ground shifted permanently beneath everything that had been true about this situation until tonight, and nothing that came next was going to look like anything that had come before. The truck drove on. The stars burned cold above the basin, and the word unwanted sat folded in Jace's inside pocket, pressed against his chest, carrying its weight in the dark like something that had always been waiting to become its opposite. The call came at 2:47 a.m. Jace was in the hallway outside the interview room at Lander County Sheriff's Department, sitting in a plastic chair with his elbows on his knees and his coffee gone cold in his hand, watching through the narrow wire glass window as a woman named Dr. Reyes, soft voice, careful hands, 17 years of forensic child interview work, visible in every unhurried movement, sat across from Ember at a small table and listened. Just listened. Ember was talking, had been talking for 40 minutes. Jace could not hear the words through the glass, but he could see the shape of them. The way Ember's hands moved when she described something spatial, the way she went still when she described something that had happened to her directly, the way she occasionally looked toward the window and found his face there, and returned to Dr. Reyes with something slightly less tight in her shoulders. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Goose. One word in the text. Now. He was on his feet before he finished reading it. He found Harlan in the corridor and said, "My club." And Harlan read his face and said, "Go," without requiring elaboration. And Jace was through the department's back door and in his truck, and moving before 30 seconds had elapsed. Goose picked up on the first ring. 3 vehicles, Goose said. His voice was the voice of a man already in it. Came in hard off the highway, bypassed the gate entirely, went through the south fence. The same cut from tonight. We've got 8, maybe 10 men on the property. Armed. They're not here to talk. Behind Goose's voice, Jace could hear it. Not gunfire. Not yet. But the sounds that preceded it. Boots on frozen gravel. Shouting. The particular percussion of a physical confrontation in a cold enclosed space. "Anyone down?" Jace said. "Petey took a hit. He's up. Cal's got a cut on his head. We're holding the building." "Police?" "Called before I called you. 8 minutes out minimum." 8 minutes. The highway was 40 miles, and Jace was already at 65 and pushing the truck harder into the dark. "Hold the building," Jace said. "Don't go outside. Make them come to you." "Jace, hold the building, Goose." He drove. The speedometer touched 92 on the straight basin section, and the truck shuddered slightly at the threshold of what its chassis wanted to do at that speed, and he held it there, and the desert went past on both sides as a single undifferentiated dark. His hands were steady on the wheel. His heartbeat was elevated, and he was aware of it, and he was not fighting it. Elevated heart rate was information, it was the body preparing, and he had learned a long time ago to let the body prepare rather than suppress it and find it unavailable when the moment arrived. He thought about Petey taking a hit. 26 years old, made wind chimes from shell casings, drove to Winnemucca to buy shoes the right size. He thought about Cal with a cut on his head, Cal who said the things nobody else wanted to say, and said them with the flat precision of a man who had learned that honesty was the only workable material. He thought about Switch in his armchair and Denny in the garage and Goose who had not left a door he was told to hold in 20 years of knowing him. He covered 40 miles in 26 minutes. He came off the highway onto the county road without braking enough, and the truck's rear end stepped out on the frost, and he caught it with opposite lock and brought it back and didn't slow down, the gravel road banging underneath him in irregular percussion. The clubhouse neon a red and blue smear ahead in the dark, growing larger fast. He came through the back road and cut the lights and killed the engine and let the truck roll the last 50 yards in silence. What he saw from the tree line at the property's north edge was this. 2 of the 3 vehicles were inside the perimeter, through the torn open section of south fence. 1 man was down near the fence line. Not his, the posture was wrong. This was someone from the other side in a position of involuntary stillness. The building's front door was intact and closed. The kitchen windows on the south face were broken. Light inside. Movement inside. They were in the building. He moved along the tree line to the garage and entered through the side door that had a broken latch that nobody had fixed because it was on the interior face and the exterior was solid. Inside the garage smelled of oil and cold metal, and he moved through it by memory, in the dark, found the back wall, found the door connecting garage to diner storeroom. He went through. The sounds were immediate and specific. From the common room, impact sounds, furniture moving, voices. Not words yet, just the sound of confrontation. He moved through the storeroom and into the kitchen and stopped at the kitchen door and looked through the gap. 3 men he didn't know were between him and the common room. Big, work-built, the kind of physical presence that came from labor rather than training. But there were 3 of them, and they were between him and his people. And the corridor behind them showed him the edge of the common room where he could see Switch on his feet and bleeding from somewhere on his left side, still on his feet, that being the operative fact. He went through the kitchen door at full speed and covered the distance before any of the 3 men completed their turn, and what followed was not elegant and was not the kind of thing that produced clean outcomes, But it was fast and committed and the specific product of a man who had decided that half measures were not available tonight. And 30 seconds later, the kitchen held different furniture arrangements, and one man was not standing, and two had reconsidered their positions. He was breathing hard. His left eye had taken something in the process. Not a fist, an elbow, the particular stunning bloom of impact near the orbital bone that sent white across the vision temporarily. He blinked it clear. He went into the common room. Goose was there. Blood on his neck from a cut above his ear, shirt torn at the collar, standing over a man who had decided the floor was the correct location. Denny was at the far wall with his forearm against a larger man's throat and the wall providing the leverage. Switch was upright near the stove, one hand pressed to his left side, the other loose and ready. And in the corner near the hallway door, Cal Rourke had a man by the jacket with both hands and was saying something to him in a voice so low and flat that it barely registered as sound. The controlled rage voice, the voice below shouting, because shouting was for people who needed the volume to feel the certainty, and Cal had all the certainty he needed without the volume. 3 more men Jace didn't recognize were in various states of not standing around the room. The ratio had changed. "Petey?" Jace said. "Hallway," Goose said without looking away from the man on the floor. "He's up. Cut on his arm. Nothing structural." "The building secure?" 2 more outside. They stopped coming in when we stopped going down." Outside, distant but approaching, Jace heard it. The sound of sirens on the highway, still miles out but closing. The sound of the cavalry that always arrived after the thing it was meant to prevent had already found its shape. He crossed to Cal. The man Cal had by the jacket was 40, maybe 45, with the specific face of someone who had been making bad decisions professionally for long enough that the decisions had become structural. He looked at Jace approaching, and something moved in his eyes. Not fear exactly, something more like recalibration, the look of a man reassessing the person in front of him and not liking what the reassessment produced. "Wade Mercer sent you," Jace said. Not a question. The man said nothing. "The girls," Jace said, "the ones that came and went. Where are they?" Silence. Jace looked at him with the specific look of a man who has been awake for 6 days and driven 90 miles an hour through a Nevada desert night and put 3 men on a kitchen floor and has nothing left inside him that resembles patience or performance. The look was not anger. It was beyond anger. It was the look of a man who had arrived at a place where the only remaining question was how much of himself he was willing to spend on the answer. "I don't know what you're—" "You were on my roof," Jace said. "You cut my fence twice. You came here tonight to remove a child who is a witness to a federal crime." He stepped closer. "The federal agents who have been awake since 10 o'clock tonight because a deputy made a phone call are about 4 minutes from this property. You've got until they arrive to decide whether you're the man who helped them or the man who made their case harder. Those are the only 2 options you have left." The man looked at him. Then he looked at Cal, who had not released the jacket and whose face was in that low, flat place, the place without performance. Then he looked at Goose, who was standing 15 feet away with his arms loose at his sides and blood on his neck and the particular stillness of a man who had stopped calculating and was simply present. Then he looked back at Jace. "There's a property," he said, "outside Lovelock, 40 minutes west." He stopped. There were 4 girls there as of yesterday. The common room held the silence of men receiving information that cost something to receive. "I need an address," Jace said. The man gave it. Jace put it in his phone without taking his eyes off the man's face, confirming each number and street name with the flat repetition of someone who understood that incorrect information given under pressure was a specific category of crime that he would pursue with everything he had, and the man understood this and gave the address clean. The sirens were close now. The red and blue of approaching lights was beginning to wash across the broken south-facing windows, painting the common room walls in moving color that was the same as the neon outside and nothing like it. Jace called Harland. "Lovelock," he said when Harland picked up. "I've got an address, 4 girls, as of yesterday." He read it from his phone. "How fast can Federal get there?" He heard Harland relay it immediately. Not to him, but to someone else in the room. The clipped, efficient relay of information that has been waited for, and he heard the response in the background, 2 words, "fast," and Harland came back on. "They're moving," he said. "Jace, are you—" "We're standing," Jace said. "Your units are on the property now. Send them in." He lowered the phone. The first deputies were coming through the front door. Jace stood in the middle of his common room. The common room with the drawing on the wall, 13 motorcycles in crayon, the small pink-wheeled one at the end, and looked at his men. Goose with blood on his neck, Switch with his hand pressed to his side. Cal releasing the jacket finally, stepping back, rolling his shoulders once. Denny at the far wall. Petey in the hallway doorway with a makeshift bandage on his forearm made from what appeared to be a dish towel. Every one of them standing. He looked at them and they looked back, and the deputies were coming in with their hands on their weapons and their voices raised in the specific commanding register of law enforcement, arriving at a scene they hadn't witnessed the beginning of. And Jace raised both hands and turned to face them and said, "We're the residents, the building is secure, the men on the floor are not our people," in the controlled cooperative voice that the situation required. And underneath all of it, underneath the compliance and the deputies and the sirens and the broken windows and the blood on his people and the cold coming through the south-facing gaps and the neon painting everything red and blue. 40 miles west in Lovelock, at an address now transmitted to federal agents already in motion, 4 girls were sleeping or not sleeping in a place they had not chosen. The night was not finished, not even close. The 4 girls were recovered from the Lovelock property at 4:19 a.m. Harlan told Jace by phone while the deputies were still processing the clubhouse scene, his voice carrying the specific flatness of a man delivering news that is good in the absolute sense and costs something in every other sense. 4 girls, ages 4 through 9. Alive. Frightened. A property registered to a shell company that federal investigators had been circling for 14 months without sufficient cause to enter, until a 5-year-old on a railroad track gave them the thread that unraveled it. Wade Mercer was transferred to federal custody before sunrise. The 2 men from the roof were in county holding. The men from the clubhouse floor were processed and separated and would spend considerable time in rooms with fluorescent lights answering questions that had no good answers. The network they belonged to, the trucks, the shell company, the movement of children across state lines, was the kind of structure that took months to fully dismantle, and Harlan said so honestly, and Jace heard the honesty in it and accepted it for what it was. Not the end, the beginning of the end. Sometimes that was all you got. He brought Ember back to the clubhouse at 6 in the morning. The desert was doing the thing it did in the hour before real daylight, that specific gray-blue luminescence that came before color returned to the world, when the basin and the mountains and the highway all existed in the same flat register and the cold was at its most complete. He drove with the heater running and Ember asleep in the passenger seat, finally, genuinely asleep, her head against the window and her breathing slow and even and her hands loose in her lap for the first time in 11 days. He parked and sat for a moment in the idling truck and looked at her and looked at the clubhouse. The broken windows on the south face had been covered with plywood sometime in the hours he'd been gone. The neon sign was still running. Through the front windows he could see the warm, low light of the interior and the shapes of men inside. And when he looked long enough, he could make out Goose at the bar with his coffee and the white of a bandage on his neck and Petey's silhouette near the stove. He carried Ember inside. She didn't wake. He put her in the bunk and stood in the doorway and watched her breathe, and the hallway lamp threw its familiar light across the floor, and everything was still. By 7, the common room had coffee and the particular quiet of aftermath. Not peace exactly, but the exhausted, honest silence of people who have been through something and are still inside the fact of it. Switch was on the couch with his side bandaged properly. Denny's work. Cal was at the table with both hands around a mug and his eyes on the middle distance. The drawing on the wall was still there, the 13 motorcycles in crayon, undamaged. Nobody said much. After a while, Goose sat down beside Jace at the bar, and they drank their coffee and looked at the room and at the drawing and at the gray morning light coming through the south windows around the edges of the plywood. "The hearing's in 2 days, Goose said. "I know. Frank thinks the emergency placement converts clean given the federal involvement." "Frank said likely," Jace said. "Not clean." Goose turned his mug in his hands. "You scared?" Jace was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. Goose nodded. He didn't say anything else about it, and he didn't need to. From the hallway came a small sound. They both looked. Ember was standing at the hallway's end in her socks, hair loose, eyes still carrying sleep. the blanket from her bunk trailing from one hand. She looked at the room, at the men in it, at the plywood on the windows, at the coffee on the bar, with the morning check expression, the inventory. Then she crossed the room and climbed onto the stool beside Jace and put her elbows on the bar and looked at the crayon drawing on the far wall. Jace poured warm milk into a mug and set it in front of her. She wrapped both hands around it. Outside, the desert was filling slowly with gray light, and somewhere 40 miles west, 4 girls were in a room with people who knew how to help them, and somewhere in a federal facility, Wade Mercer was in a different kind of room, and the word unwanted was still in Jace's inside pocket, pressed against his chest, and he thought about taking it out and thought about what he would do with it, and then he thought he knew. "Ember," he said. She looked at him. He took the folded note from his pocket and set it on the bar between them. She looked at it. She knew what it was. She'd known since the first morning. He understood now. She'd known what it said, and she'd been carrying that knowledge alongside everything else she carried. He put his thumb over the word, covered it completely. "That's not what you are," he said. She looked at his thumb on the paper. Then she looked at him with those dark eyes that had been reading adult faces in the dark since before she understood why she needed to. She reached out and put her small hand over his. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then she picked up her mug and turned back to the drawing on the wall, the 13 motorcycles, the small pink-wheeled one at the end, and she looked at it with the expression of private ownership, the expression of someone in a space that was theirs. The coffee steamed, the plywood held the cold out. The neon sign buzzed its familiar frequency in the early gray light, and the Iron Vulture's MC sat in their battered common room at the end of the longest night any of them had lived through in years. And the silence among them was not the silence of men who had lost something, or the silence of men waiting for the next hard thing. It was the silence of men who had, without planning it or naming it or being the kind of men who named things, built something that held, not perfect, not easy, not without its cost written plainly on their faces and their bodies and the plywood over the south windows, but standing, still standing. The desert went gold outside as the sun finally cleared the eastern mountains, the first real color of the morning flooding across the basin floor, and the neon sign that had burned through every cold, dark night since the beginning flickered once and held, and somewhere inside the building, a child who had been left with a word pinned to her chest sat with both hands around a warm mug and looked at a drawing she had made and knew, in the wordless, bone-deep way that children know the things that matter, exactly where she was. Home.